The morning Silas Granger walked onto Abigail Rowan's property, he didn't knock. He didn't even slow his horse. He rode straight through her front gate, let it swing open behind him, and dropped a folded paper onto her porch steps without looking at her face. 30 days, he said. Then I take the land. Abigail was standing 20 feet away, a bucket of water in each hand, mud on her boots, sweat on her collar despite the cold. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. 64 rabbits watched from behind the fence she'd built with her own hands. And Silas Granger laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, just the quiet, dismissive laugh of a man who has already decided how the story ends. If that were you, if everything you'd built, every risk you'd taken, every person who said you were wrong came down to 30 days and a piece of paper, what would you do? Stay with me. Because what happened next on this frontier changed an entire community forever. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end. I promise you, it is worth every minute. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Abigail Rowan arrived at the Clearwater homestead on a Tuesday in late September, which was, by most practical measures, already too late in the season to do anything useful with the land. The wagon that brought her out from town had belonged to a hauling man named Chester Briggs, who charged her 75 cents for the ride and spent the entire 40 minutes of it telling her, without being asked, everything that was wrong with the property she was heading toward. The well had gone mineral bitter. The East Field hadn't produced a real crop in 3 seasons. The previous owner, a man named Holt, who had moved his family back east after his wife got sick, had left the barn roof with a gap along the north ridge wide enough to let a draft straight through. Chester said all of this not with malice, but with the tired certainty of a man who had watched too many people arrive at bad properties with good intentions and leave 2 years later with nothing. "You got family out here?" he asked her. "No," Abigail said. "Husband coming out after?" "No." Chester was quiet for a moment. Then, "You alone?" "That's what no means, Mr. Briggs." He didn't say much after that, but she caught him glancing at her twice before they reached the property line. That particular kind of glance that took in her size, her travel-worn dress, her hands that were softer than a frontier woman's hands probably should have been, and filed all of it under a category that men like Chester Briggs carried their whole lives without ever naming it out loud. She noticed. She always noticed. She had been noticing that look her entire life, and she had learned, somewhere around the age of 14, that the only useful response to it was to stop performing for the person giving it and go back to her own thoughts. The homestead was worse than Chester had described and better than she'd feared, which she considered an acceptable starting position. The house itself was small but structurally sound. 2 rooms, a cook stove that needed a new flue pipe, 3 windows, and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left as though it had grown tired of standing straight. The barn was larger than she'd expected, and even with the gap in the north roof line, it was dry inside, except for one corner where water had been pooling long enough to rot the floorboard underneath. The East Field was the real problem. She walked it the first evening, pushing her boots through soil that felt almost powdery, not dry in a way that rain could fix, but depleted in a way that told you something fundamental had been taken out of it over years without being put back. She stood in the middle of that field for a long time. She had spent 11 years working in her aunt's textile shop in Cincinnati, learning every practical thing there was to know about fiber, how to grade it, spin it, process it, what made one batch worth twice the price of another. She had read everything she could find about frontier farming on the side. Not because anyone told her to, because she wanted to know how things worked. She had a particular hunger for understanding systems, how one thing fed into another, how a failure in one place created an opportunity somewhere else if you were paying attention. She was 29 years old, she was carrying more debt than she was comfortable with. She was standing in the middle of a dead field as the sun went down. And she was, despite all of it, not afraid. Tired, yes. A little hollowed out from the journey, but not afraid. Fear, in Abigail's experience, was most useful when it was telling you something specific. Right now, it wasn't telling her anything she didn't already know. She knew the soil was bad. She knew the winter was coming. She knew she was alone and the nearest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile away, and that she was a woman of considerable size who had shown up without a husband on a broken-down homestead, and that every person within 20 miles had already placed their bets on how long she'd last. She went back inside and made herself dinner from what she'd brought in her pack, and she sat by the cook stove reading by lamplight until her eyes gave out. She slept well. That surprised her later when she thought about it. She slept better that first night on the frontier than she had slept in years. The rabbits came into her life exactly 11 days after she arrived, in the form of a trader named Dolph Marsh, who was passing through Clearwater Junction with a flatbed wagon and a problem. Dolph was not a bad man. He was a practical man, which sometimes comes out to the same thing. He had taken on 64 rabbits in trade from a failed hutch operation 2 counties over, figuring he could sell them in pieces, meat, pelts, breeding stock, before he reached his next stop. He had not figured that 3 of them would die in transit from the stress, that 6 more would stop eating, that the smell would drive off 2 paying customers at his last stop, and that he would arrive in Clearwater Junction with 64 rabbits still alive and no remaining patience for any of them. He pulled up near the general store and started asking around. Abigail was inside buying flue pipe hardware when she heard him through the open door. 64 rabbits, Dolph was saying to the small crowd that had gathered with the specific, unhurried curiosity of frontier people who found watching other people's problems more entertaining than most available alternatives. Good animals, most of them. Different breeds. I'll take $3 for the lot, or I'll take them to the butcher and be done with it before noon. Abigail came out with her hardware under her arm and looked at the wagon. The rabbits were in rough wooden crates stacked 4 high. Most of them were pressed against the slats, eyes wide, breathing fast. A few weren't moving much at all. They had the particular look of animals that had been handled carelessly for too long, not broken, not sick, just deeply uncertain about what was going to happen next. She knew that look. She had a complicated relationship with that look. "What breed are those 3 in the top left crate?" she asked. Dolph glanced up at her with the practiced merchant's assessment, took in her size, her plain dress, her no-nonsense expression, and apparently decided she was worth answering. "Angoras," he said, "long-haired, useless for eating, barely worth the pelt. The rest are mixed, some New Zealand, some Flemish giant, couple I couldn't tell you." "Angora fiber," Abigail said, almost to herself. "What's that?" "Nothing." She set her hardware down on the porch railing. "You said $3 for the lot?" "I'll take it." She had $9.40 to her name. After the flue pipe hardware, she'd have $7 and some change. She had a roof gap to repair, a cook stove that needed work, soil that needed amendment, and a winter that was going to arrive whether she was ready for it or not. Every rational calculation she had learned in 11 years of careful, practical living told her to walk away from 64 rabbits she had no infrastructure to house and no real plan to feed. $3, she repeated. $3. She reached into her coat pocket and counted out the coins. The small crowd watching this transaction had the good manners to wait until Dolph was loading the crates onto her borrowed handcart before they started talking among themselves. She could hear them, but she didn't look back. Is she serious? Paid good money for those. What's she going to do with 64 rabbits? She's the one took the Holt place, came out alone. A pause that was doing a lot of work. You know how that goes. She didn't look back. She pushed the handcart down the road toward home and didn't stop until she was past the last building in town. Getting 64 rabbits into a barn with no existing hutch infrastructure was an experience that reorganized Abigail's understanding of chaos. She got the first 2 crates inside and set them down and opened one to check on the animals, and 3 of them immediately pushed through the gap before she could get a hand in, and then spent 45 minutes under the barn floor where she couldn't reach them. By the time she'd gotten all the crates inside and all the escapees recaptured and the barn door shut so nothing else could get out, she was sweating through her dress. She had a long scratch up her left forearm from a set of back claws she hadn't anticipated, and she was sitting on the barn floor in the near dark while 61 rabbits regarded her with what she chose to interpret as cautious goodwill. The other 3 were still under the floorboards. She sat there for a while, just breathing. "All right," she said out loud. There was no one to hear her except the rabbits, which was fine. She had grown comfortable talking to herself over the years. It had started as a way to think through problems and had become, somewhere along the line, just the way she processed the world. We're going to figure this out. She didn't sleep much that night. She spent most of it reading back through every note she'd ever made about fiber production and rabbit husbandry, which she'd been collecting since she was 22 and had first read an agricultural pamphlet about Angora wool processing in a library back in Cincinnati. She hadn't known then why she was saving it. Sometimes you collect information about things you don't have a use for yet, and it sits in the back of your mind like money you're keeping for something, and you don't know what until it walks up to you on a trader's wagon. By morning, she had a plan. Not a complete one, not a comfortable one, but something with enough structure to start. The boy showed up 3 days later. His name was Eli Dawson, and he was 14 years old, and he appeared at her barn door at 7 in the morning on a Thursday without any prior arrangement, holding a biscuit tin his mother had sent and looking at the rabbits through the door gap with an expression of complete, unguarded fascination. "My ma said you bought Dolph Marsh's rabbits," he said. "Word travels," Abigail said. She was in the middle of building the first hutch frame out of scrap lumber she'd found in the barn's back corner, and she didn't stop working while she talked. That was something she'd learned early. If you stop what you're doing every time someone wants to have a conversation, you'll never get anything done. She also said, Eli stopped. She also said what? He looked at his boots. He was the kind of kid who told the truth when he probably shouldn't, which Abigail recognized as a quality that would make his life harder and more interesting than average. She said you probably didn't know what you were doing. She might be right, Abigail said. Hand me that length of wire. He handed her the wire. She wrapped it, cut it, moved to the next joint. What are you building? He asked. Hutch system, tiered. I want them off the ground and out of each other's way, and I want the waste to fall through into collection trays underneath. Eli looked at the sketch she'd tacked to the barn wall. His eyebrows went up slightly. That's a lot of rabbits to be keeping if you're not eating them. I know. So why are you keeping them? Abigail set down her tools and looked at him properly for the first time. He was a serious-faced kid, not sullen, just thoughtful. The kind of face that asked real questions because it actually wanted real answers. 3 of those rabbits are Angoras, she said. You know what Angora fiber sells for in Cincinnati? He didn't. She told him. His eyebrows went considerably higher. For rabbit wool? It's not wool technically, but yes. And the rest of them? She picked up her tools again. What comes out of a rabbit is one of the best natural fertilizers that exists for depleted soil. This whole east field out there has been stripped out. I need to rebuild the nitrogen content before I can grow anything useful in it. 64 rabbits are going to produce enough material to amend that field by spring. Eli was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The math, the logic, whether it made sense. She appreciated that he didn't immediately agree with her or immediately dismiss her. He actually thought about it. You need help building those hutches, he said finally. I do. I could come on Saturdays. What does your mother say about that? She doesn't need to know every detail of my Saturday. Abigail pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. I'll pay you in biscuits if your mother's going to send them anyway. That seems fair, Eli said, and picked up the other end of the lumber she was about to wrestle alone. The news about the rabbits made it around Clearwater Junction in the way that news travels in small frontier communities. Not quickly, exactly, but thoroughly. By the end of the first week, Abigail was aware that she had become a specific kind of story that people told each other. The overweight woman from back east who'd spent her last savings on animals nobody sensible would keep, who was going to lose her shirt before the first hard freeze. She heard it secondhand through Eli, who heard it firsthand because 14-year-olds are essentially invisible to adults, who are talking about things they think children aren't old enough to understand. Mr. Granger said you'll be defaulting on your loan before February, Eli told her one Saturday, with the slightly uncomfortable look of someone delivering a message they hadn't asked to carry. Abigail didn't look up from what she was doing, which was sorting fiber samples by length and grade. What did Mr. Granger say exactly? He said, Eli lowered his voice slightly, even though there was no one else in the barn. He said, that woman has guaranteed her own failure. Those exact words. He said it to Mr. Hollis at the feed store, and I was right there stacking bags. Does that bother you? Abigail set down the fiber sample she was holding and considered the question properly, which was the only way she knew how to consider questions. Silas Granger is not a stupid man, she said. He's looking at what I'm doing from the outside, and from the outside it probably does look like a bad bet. He's not wrong about the numbers as he understands them. But he's wrong about what you're doing with them. Yes, she said. But I can't explain that to him yet. I need to show him. Eli nodded slowly. That's going to take time. Most things worth doing take time, she said, and picked up the next fiber sample. That was the thing about being the person who saw something that other people couldn't see yet. There was no shortcut through it. You couldn't explain your way to being believed. You just had to build the thing and then stand next to it while people either came around or didn't. She had known that going in. She had not quite known how heavy the waiting would feel. What she had not calculated, could not have fully calculated, was the particular cruelty of being watched while you struggled. It wasn't that anyone was actively malicious. That would have been, in some ways, easier to bear. It was the ambient quality of the doubt. The way conversations in the general store shifted slightly when she walked in. The way eyes tracked her across a room with that particular mixture of pity and entertainment that people reserve for someone they believe is failing in slow motion. She was a large woman in a world that had very specific ideas about what large women were good for and what they weren't. She was unmarried in a community where that carried its own set of quiet assumptions. She was keeping rabbits in a barn instead of food in a root cellar, and she was alone, and she was from somewhere else. And the combination of all those things created a kind of story about her that people were already telling before they'd learned anything real about who she was. She couldn't fix that story by arguing with it. She could only do the work, so she did the work. She built the Hutch system with Eli's help over 3 Saturdays, and then spent the following 2 weeks learning the individual personalities and habits of 64 rabbits in the particular, painstaking way that only comes from close daily observation. She learned which ones were social and which needed space. She learned which ones ate differently when stressed and which ones needed to be handled a certain way or they'd injure themselves trying to get free. She learned that 3 of the Flemish giants were from the same litter and would pine if separated, and that the lead Angora, a large, imperious, extremely opinionated female she eventually named Harriet, had specific views about when feeding should happen and would make her displeasure loudly known if those views were not respected. By the end of October, she knew all 64 of them individually. She had also begun the first collection of Angora fiber, hand-harvesting it from Harriet and the other 2 Angoras with the careful technique she'd practiced on salvaged samples back in Cincinnati. The fiber was extraordinary, softer than anything she'd worked with in the textile shop, lighter, warmer, with that characteristic halo that made Angora blends feel almost weightless against the skin. She held the first real harvest in her hands on a cold Tuesday evening, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt something that wasn't determination or exhaustion or careful calculated optimism. She felt joy. The specific, startling, completely unperformed joy of a person who has just confirmed that the thing they believed in is actually real. She sat with it for exactly 1 evening. Then she went back to work because the soil amendments needed turning, because the north barn roof still needed patching, because the winter was coming, and it did not care whether she was ready. The letter from Silas Granger's office arrived on the 2nd Friday of November. It was not the foreclosure notice that would come later, in a different kind of cold, with a different weight to it. This was a preliminary reminder of terms, which was how bank letters always started before they became something worse. The language was formal and impersonal in the way that formal, impersonal language was specifically designed to make you feel small. Payment of the principal installment and accumulated interest is required by the 1st of February. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in the tin box where she kept her important documents. She went outside and stood in the east field. The first amendments were in. The soil smelled different already. Not fully alive yet, but moving in that direction. She could see it in the color, in the way it held moisture differently than it had in September. It was working. It was working, and she had no money, and winter was arriving in 3 weeks. And the only thing standing between her and losing everything she had risked was 64 rabbits and the Angora fiber she was harvesting by hand, and the gut-deep conviction that she was right about this, that she had always been right about this, and that being right about something when everyone around you believes you're wrong is one of the loneliest feelings that exists. She stood in the field until her feet went cold in her boots. Then she went back inside, started a fire, pulled Harriet's latest fiber harvest out of the box she kept it in, picked up her spinning tools, and got to work. The spinning wheel. Abigail had bought secondhand from a widow in Cincinnati was not a good spinning wheel. It had a wobble in the drive wheel that caused the yarn to go uneven if she lost her focus for even a few seconds, and the flyer assembly had been repaired twice with what looked like carpenter's glue and optimism. She'd had it evaluated by a proper wheelwright before she left the city, and he'd told her it would last another year if she was careful, and maybe 6 months if she wasn't. She was not always careful. She was often tired. But the wheel worked, and working with imperfect tools was something Abigail had been doing her entire adult life. So she made her adjustments, kept her foot pressure light on the treadle, compensated for the wobble with her drafting hand, stopped every 20 minutes to let the assembly cool before it started skipping, and she spun. The first batch of Angora she processed was not good. She'd expected that. The staple length on Harriet's first harvest was inconsistent because Abigail hadn't yet learned exactly when to harvest each animal for optimal fiber. Too early, and the fiber was too short to draft cleanly. Too late, and it started to mat at the skin. The resulting yarn was lumpy in places, thinner than she wanted in others, and the halo, the characteristic soft cloud of Angora fiber that gave the finished textile its extraordinary warmth, was there but uneven. She spun it anyway. She knitted it up into a small test swatch and held it against her cheek and closed her eyes. Even imperfect Angora was warmer than anything else she'd ever touched. She unraveled the swatch, wound the yarn back on the bobbin, and started over. Not because she was a perfectionist, she was not, particularly, but because she needed to understand what she was working with before she could figure out what to do with it. Understanding came from doing the thing wrong until you understood why it was wrong, and then doing it again. By the second week of November, she had 3 bobbins of usable yarn and a clearer picture of what the Angora could actually produce at scale. She also had a more complicated problem, which was that 3 bobbins of yarn was not going to convince anyone of anything. She needed volume, and she had only 3 Angora rabbits, and the harvest cycle for Angora was roughly every 3 to 4 months, which meant she was not going to have a significant fiber supply from the rabbits alone before winter arrived in earnest. She sat with that problem for 2 days. Then she started looking at the other rabbits differently. It was Eli who noticed it first, the way 14-year-olds notice things that adults have already decided don't need to be looked at. I was in the barn on a Saturday morning helping her clean the collection trays beneath the hutch system, a job that was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds, and that Eli performed without complaint, which she considered one of his better qualities. When he stopped and held up a large clump of what had accumulated in the tray beneath 3 of the Flemish giants. "This is a lot," he said. "That's the point," Abigail said. "That goes on the east field." "No, I know that. I mean..." He turned the clump over in his gloved hands. "There's a lot of it. Like, a lot more than I expected from 3 rabbits." Abigail looked up from what she was doing. "Calculate it out. An adult rabbit produces roughly 1 pound of manure per day. 64 rabbits, that's 64 pounds a day. Nearly 450 pounds a week." Eli's mouth opened slightly. "Exactly," she said. "Now help me get it into the wheelbarrow." But she could see him still working through it while they loaded. That particular expression he got when a number was rearranging his understanding of something. He was good with numbers in the practical way that kids got good at things they actually used, and she had noticed early that he was faster at the applied arithmetic of farming than most adults she'd met. "At that rate," he said finally, "by spring you'd have..." "Enough to amend the full east field and start on the south quarter," she said. "Yes. And the field would actually grow things. Good things, in quantity." He set down the next load and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why doesn't everyone do this? Some people do. It's not a secret. It's just not fashionable out here." She pushed the wheelbarrow toward the barn door. "People on the frontier tend to keep animals they can eat or sell as livestock. Rabbits make people think of Sunday dinner, not soil management. But you're not eating them." "No. People think that's strange. I know they do." Eli pulled the barn door open for her and held it against the wind, which had picked up overnight and was carrying the first real cold edge of the coming season. They both felt it, that specific sharpness that the air got before snow, not just cold, but anticipatory. "Mrs. Hollis told my mother you were going to starve before Christmas," he said. "Sorry, I thought you should know." "Mrs. Hollis is working with the information she has," Abigail said, and pushed the wheelbarrow out into the field. She didn't starve before Christmas, but it was closer than she would have admitted to anyone. The root vegetables she'd gotten into the ground late in September had not produced as well as she'd hoped. The soil was still too depleted in the south beds, and she'd prioritized the east field for the First Amendments, which was the right long-term decision and a genuinely difficult short-term one. She was eating more carefully than she liked, which was a polite way of saying she was eating less than she should, and she was cold in the house because she was burning the wood carefully to make the cord she'd put up last longer than it otherwise would. She didn't complain about this to anyone. It was her situation, and she was managing it. She had known going in that the first winter would be the hardest, and she had planned for hardship in the abstract, and was now living it in the specific, which was the difference between reading about something and being inside it. What kept her anchored through November was the work itself. The spinning, the fiber processing, the slow accumulation of something from nothing that was the particular satisfaction of making things with your hands. She had expanded beyond the Angora by then. The pelts from the 3 rabbits that had died in transit with Dolph Marsh had been cured and set aside, and she'd been studying what she could do with them. Pelts were not her primary interest. She was a fiber person, not a fur person, and there was a meaningful difference in the skill set. But she had practical knowledge of textile work that transferred well enough, and she began experimenting with small items: a pair of mittens, a hat lining, a collar for a coat. The mittens were the first thing she made that surprised her. She had lined them inside with a thin layer of the cured pelt, the fur side in, obviously, and the outer shell was a dense knitted wool from yarn she'd bought at the general store. She made them for herself out of practical necessity and then put them on one morning when the temperature had dropped overnight into territory she hadn't yet experienced, and went outside to check on the water situation in the barn. Her hands did not get cold. She was outside for 40 minutes in weather that normally made her fingers ache within 10, and her hands were warm. Not just tolerable, warm. She kept taking the mittens off and putting them back on, standing in the cold, genuinely surprised. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. Then she started making another pair. The problem with the mittens, or rather, the opportunity that the mittens represented, revealed itself slowly, the way important things often did. She made a second pair and then a third, working through the evenings when the light was bad for anything requiring close vision, just to understand what she had. She made a hat lining and a muffler and a set of coat liner pieces that could be sewn into any standard frontier coat. Each time she wore them, or held them against her face, or simply sat with the knowledge of what they could do in serious cold, she felt the same thing she'd felt holding that first Angora swatch. This was something real. The frontier winter that everyone around her was preparing to endure was going to be the thing that proved her right or proved her dead. She had started to understand that those might be the only 2 options. The loan payment was due February 1st. She had no savings to speak of. She had fiber, and she had pelts, and she had 3 Angora rabbits who needed at least another month before the next harvest was ready. And she had 61 other rabbits producing material for the field, but not yet for the bank. She needed to sell something, and she needed to sell it before December was over. The first person she approached was Margaret Hollis, which in retrospect she would describe as a lesson in choosing your first customer more carefully. Margaret Hollis ran the dry goods section of her husband's general store and had opinions about everything, which she delivered with the specific authority of a woman who had lived on the frontier for 23 years and considered that tenure to be a qualification in itself. She was not a cruel woman, but she was a certain woman, and certainty and cruelty can look nearly identical from the receiving end. Abigail brought the mittens in on a Thursday morning, wrapped in cloth, and set them on the counter. "I'd like to talk to you about selling these through the store," she said. Margaret looked at the mittens. She picked one up. She turned it over. Her expression did not change, which Abigail recognized as a specific kind of response that wasn't neutrality, but was performing it. "Rabbit fur," Margaret said. "Rabbit pelt liner, wool exterior. I can also do coat liners, hat linings, mufflers, in the same construction." Margaret set the mitten down. "What are you asking for them?" Abigail had priced it out carefully. Material cost, time, what comparable items sold for in Cincinnati with inferior construction. She named her price. Margaret's expression shifted into something that was almost kind, which was worse than if it had been dismissive. "Abigail, honey, people out here aren't going to pay that for rabbit mittens. They might if they knew what rabbit mittens at this construction level can do in real cold. They've gotten through winters before without rabbit mittens. Some of them," Abigail said carefully. "Not all of them. That landed somewhere." She saw it in the slight pause before Margaret answered. The frontier had a specific relationship with winter mortality that nobody liked to talk about directly, but that everyone carried: the memory of a bad season, a neighbor who didn't make it through, a child who got too cold too fast. But Margaret put the mittens back on the cloth and pushed them toward her. "I think you'd be better off focusing on food crops come spring. That's what people need out here, not rabbit fur." Abigail picked up the mittens. "Thank you for your time," she said, and left. She made it to the edge of town before the frustration caught up with her. Not rage, not tears, just a hot, grinding feeling behind her sternum that she recognized as the cost of being dismissed by someone who hadn't done the work of actually understanding what she was showing them. She stood by the road for a minute with her hands in her coat pockets and her jaw tight and let herself feel it, because not feeling it was just pushing it somewhere it would come back from worse. Then she walked back toward home because there was work to do, and feeling sorry for yourself only counted as rest if you actually let it rest you. It was Eli, again, who changed the direction. He showed up on a Tuesday, which was not a Saturday, which meant something had happened. "My pa's hands," he said, before he was fully through the barn door. He was red-faced from hurrying and his breath was coming fast. He's been having trouble with them since last winter. The cold gets into his joints and by December he can barely grip the reins. Ma's tried everything. Wool gloves, double-layered, nothing helps past a certain temperature. Abigail looked at him. How bad? Bad enough that last February he couldn't work the horses for 2 weeks. We nearly lost income we couldn't lose. He stopped, caught his breath. I told him about your mittens. Eli, I know you went to Mrs. Hollis and she said no. But that's because Mrs. Hollis has never had to drive a wagon in February with hands that stop working. He was looking at her with the particular intensity of a kid who has thought something through and is not going to be talked out of it. My pa would try them. He'd actually try them, and if they worked, he'd tell people. Abigail thought about this for exactly as long as it took to think about it. Bring him Saturday, she said. Thomas Dawson was a quiet man in the way that men who worked hard and slept hard tended to be quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned to spend his words on things that mattered. He came on Saturday morning with Eli and stood in the barn doorway and looked at the rabbits for a long moment before he looked at Abigail. My boy says you've got something for hands, he said. I have something worth trying, she said. I won't promise more than that. He nodded. That was apparently the right answer because he came the rest of the way into the barn. She fitted him for the mittens. His hands were large and work-worn, the knuckles enlarged from years of cold and labor, and she had to adjust the pattern on the spot, which she did with pins and without apology, talking through what she was doing and why while he stood patiently and watched her work. She explained the construction, the reason for the pelt liner, the way the fiber trapped air differently from wool alone. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He was the kind of man who listened completely before he formed an opinion, which she respected. She finished the fitting, wrote down the measurements, and looked up. I can have them done in 5 days. What are you asking? She named the price, at the same price she'd named to Margaret Hollis. Thomas Dawson didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and counted out the money and put it on the workbench. 5 days, he said. 5 days, she confirmed. He turned to leave. At the barn door, he stopped and looked back. Mrs. Hollis tell you the price was too high? Abigail hesitated, then, she did. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Margaret Hollis has never worked outside in February a day in her life. He pulled the door open. 5 days. Thomas Dawson got his mittens in 4 days because she pushed herself, and he wore them for 2 days before he came back. She was in the east field turning a compost section when she saw him coming up the road, and something about the pace of his walk, not hurried exactly, but deliberate in a way that was different from his usual manner, made her put down her tools and wait. He stopped at the field fence, pulled off the mitten on his right hand and held it out toward her, which was a strange gesture until she understood it. He wanted her to feel what she already knew was true, that the inside was still warm from his body heat, even out here in the wind. My hands didn't give me trouble, he said. She looked at him. 2 full days, morning chores, afternoon fence work, drove the wagon into town and back yesterday. Usually by the end of a day like that, I can't close my fist properly. He put the mitten back on. Not one day last winter I made it through without losing grip by late afternoon. Abigail exhaled slowly. She had been right. She had known she was right, but knowing and having it confirmed in front of you by a person who had nothing to gain from telling you are 2 different weights entirely. I told 4 men in town, Thomas said. All of them have the same problem I have. All of them want a pair. She did the arithmetic instantly. 4 pairs at her price point was more than she'd made in the first 2 months combined. It wouldn't touch the loan, but it was something. It was the beginning of something. Tell them 2 weeks, she said. I need to plan the work. I'll tell them. He started back down the road, then stopped. My wife wants coat liners. I can do coat liners. She'll come by. He walked, stopped again. Didn't turn around this time. You shouldn't have had to go to Margaret Hollis first. Then he was gone, and Abigail stood in the field with the wind hitting her face and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of feeling something that was not quite triumph, but was adjacent to it. That particular satisfaction of a person who has been told they are wrong and has found a way, without arguing, to be right. Then she went back inside and picked up her tools, because she had 4 pairs of mittens and coat liner panels and a loan payment in 2 months, and 30 seconds was all she could afford. December came in cold and stayed that way. Not the killing cold, not yet, but the kind of persistent bone-deep chill that settled over the frontier like something with weight and intention, turning the mornings blue and the evenings short, and making the space between the barn and the house feel longer than the distance warranted. Abigail worked through it. She had restructured her entire day around the production schedule, which meant she was up before dawn to feed the rabbits and clean the trays and check the water. Water froze, and frozen water meant sick rabbits, and sick rabbits meant losing inventory. She could not afford to lose. And then inside at the wheel and the work table from first light until her hands cramped or her eyes gave out, whichever came first, she made mistakes. She made plenty of them. She rushed a seam on a coat liner panel for Thomas Dawson's wife, and it puckered at the shoulder, and she pulled the whole thing apart and redid it, which cost her an evening she didn't have. She miscalculated a yarn quantity and ran short mid-project and had to adjust the construction on the fly in a way that technically worked but bothered her every time she looked at it. She dropped a full bobbin of Angora yarn on the barn floor and spent 20 minutes picking fiber off the dirt because she could not afford to lose it. She was not graceful. She was not serene. She was a woman working very hard in difficult circumstances and getting things wrong at regular intervals and correcting them and working harder, which is what actually surviving something looks like, not the way it gets described later. Eli came on Saturdays and helped with the rabbit work, so she could free up more of her own time for production. He was good with the animals by then, had learned their individual temperaments the way she had, stopped flinching at the ones that scratched, developed a particular patience with the 3 Flemish giants who had to be handled as a unit or they got agitated. He never complained about the cold or the smell or the early hours. He brought biscuits when his mother sent them and otherwise asked questions and worked, which was all she needed from him. They talked while they worked. Not always about the rabbits or the business. Sometimes just the conversation that happens between 2 people who spend regular time together and have run out of the surface topics. He told her about school, which he attended 3 days a week when the weather allowed and found mostly tolerable except for the geography portions, which he considered suspiciously theoretical. She told him about Cincinnati, about the textile shop, about the strange compressed world of a city that had seemed enormous when she'd first arrived there at 18, and had slowly revealed itself to be very small once you knew how it worked. "Why did you leave?" he asked one Saturday in mid-December. They were in the barn, and the wind was working at the walls with real effort. "My aunt sold the shop. New owner didn't want to keep the staff. She was harvesting fiber from the second Angora, a calmer animal than Harriet, who she'd named simply 2 in a fit of unromantic practicality. And I'd been saving for the homestead for 4 years. It was the push I needed." "You'd been planning this for 4 years?" "Longer than that, but saving for 4 years, yes." Eli was quiet for a moment. "People in town think you just showed up and did this on an impulse." "I know they do. It's not an impulse." "No," she said. "It's a very long plan that got compressed into very fast action because I ran out of time for a slower version." He thought about that. "Is that why you bought the rabbit so fast? Because you'd already thought it all through?" She stopped harvesting and considered the question properly. "I bought the rabbits fast because I recognized the opportunity, and I'd already done the thinking. But also," she paused, "I bought them because they were going to die otherwise. Those 2 things aren't separate." Eli nodded slowly. That seemed to settle something for him. He went back to the water check without saying anything else. And she went back to the fiber, and the barn was warm from the animals' collective heat, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate without expecting to, the particular, unconscious warmth of 64 living creatures, all in the same space, all breathing, all unbothered. The order that changed things came on the 19th of December, and it came from an unexpected direction. Reverend Caleb Marsh, no relation to Dolph the Trader, though it was a name that made Abigail's expression do a small, involuntary thing whenever she heard it. Had a wife named Dorothea who was thin as a rail and felt the cold catastrophically, to the point where the previous winter she had spent most of January and February in bed with what everyone politely called a chest condition, and what was, Abigail suspected based on the symptoms Eli had described secondhand, hypothermia working slowly at the edges of a body that couldn't maintain its own heat. Dorothea Marsh appeared at Abigail's door on a Tuesday evening without warning. She was small and composed and impeccably dressed in a way that suggested habit rather than wealth. And she stood on the porch with the cold at her back and looked at Abigail with the direct eyes of a woman who had decided something and wasn't going to waste time getting to it. "I've heard things about your work," she said. "Come in," Abigail said, and opened the door wider. They sat at the kitchen table and Dorothea examined everything Abigail put in front of her with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who was not going to be sold into anything but was genuinely trying to understand. She held the mittens. She ran her fingers over the coat liner panels. She asked specific questions about construction, about fiber source, about washability, practical questions from a woman who had to maintain things herself. "The lining," Dorothea said, turning a mitten inside out to feel the pelt surface. "It doesn't compress the way wool does." "No. The air trapped in the fur structure is different. It maintains loft even under pressure." "Under gloves?" "Yes. Or inside a boot liner." Dorothea looked up. "You can do boot liners?" She hadn't done boot liners yet. The pelt pieces she had were small, and the construction would be different. Curved, fitted, needing to shed moisture from the foot upward rather than simply retain warmth. But she could see exactly how it would work. She could see the pattern in her mind clearly enough to draw it immediately if she had paper in front of her. "Yes," she said. "My husband's congregation," Dorothea said, setting the mitten down carefully, "has 11 families with children under 8. Last winter, 2 of those children were seriously ill from the cold. One of them we nearly lost." She said it without drama, as a simple statement of fact that carried its own weight without embellishment. If you can make children's mittens and boot liners properly fitted, not just small versions of adult items, how many could you produce before the worst of the winter? Abigail did the arithmetic while she poured the coffee. Production time per unit, current inventory of pelt and fiber. Angora harvest schedule, hours available. It was a tight calculation. 11 families, she said. Children's sets, mittens, and boot liners per child. She looked at Dorothea. "How many children total?" 17 under 12. 3 weeks. I'd need help with the sewing portion. I can provide 2 women who sew well." Abigail set down the coffee pot. "I need the pelts in advance. I have limited inventory, and if I'm committing to a deadline, I need the material secured now." "What would you charge?" She named a number that was fair and not low. She had learned from Margaret Hollis and Thomas Dawson, both, that fair and low were not the same thing, and that pricing yourself below your value did not make people trust you more. Dorothea did not flinch. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Abigail with an expression that was almost warm. "You're not what I expected," she said. Abigail picked up her own coffee. "What did you expect?" A slight hesitation. "The stories in town paint a particular picture." "They usually do." "The stories are wrong." "Usually." Dorothea almost smiled. It was a small, controlled expression, but it was there. "I'll have the payment here by Thursday and the 2 women by Friday morning. Then I'll have your order done by the 10th of January. They shook hands across the kitchen table, and Dorothea Marsh went back out into the cold, and Abigail sat for a moment with her coffee in the quiet house before she got up to write down everything she needed to do. And in what order, because the 10th of January was not far away, and she had a winter to get through. The 2 women Dorothea sent were named Clara Pett and Ruth Annenberg, and they arrived Friday morning within 10 minutes of each other as if they had coordinated their approach, which they probably had. Clara was in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered and efficient, a farmer's wife who had been sewing practical items since she was a girl and had the speed to show for it. She walked into Abigail's workroom, looked at the patterns Abigail had laid out on the table, and sat down and got to work with a minimum of preamble that Abigail found deeply refreshing. Ruth was different. She was younger, maybe 30, and she was nervous in the way of a woman who was not sure of her reception, which made Abigail think someone had told her something discouraging before she came. She kept smoothing her apron and looking sideways at things before looking at them directly, and when she sat down at the second workstation, she arranged her tools 3 times before she touched the material. "Ruth," Abigail said. Ruth looked up. "You've been sewing how long?" 12 years, Ruth said. "Since I was 18. "Then you know what you're doing. Do what you know." Something in Ruth's shoulders came down slightly. She looked at the pattern pieces in front of her and she started to work. And within 20 minutes, it was clear that she was fast and accurate and had been holding herself back waiting to be told she was doing it wrong. Once she stopped waiting for that, she was excellent. The 3 of them worked in the kitchen-turned-workroom through the short winter days, talking sometimes and quiet other times, falling into the particular rhythm that develops between people doing shared work. Clara had opinions about everything and delivered them as facts, which Abigail found amusing. Ruth asked quiet questions and listened to the answers with complete attention. They were both curious about the rabbits and both unwilling to admit it directly, which led to a kind of elaborate indifference about the barn that Abigail let stand until one morning she simply said, "Do you want to see them?" And they both said yes immediately. Clara held one of the smaller. New Zealand does, and made an expression that she clearly didn't intend anyone to see. Ruth sat on the barn floor and let Harriet climb on her, which Harriet did with the specific confidence of an animal who has decided she likes someone and intends them to know it. "They're not what I thought," Clara said, putting the dough back carefully. "What did you think?" Abigail asked. "I thought they were just," Clara waved a hand, "rabbits, like the ones you catch in the field." "There are a lot of things," Abigail said. "They're next year's harvest. They're the reason the East Field is going to produce in spring. They're half the reason those coat liners your neighbors bought are the warmest things they've ever worn." Clara looked around the barn, at the tiered hutch system, the collection trays, the carefully organized fiber storage, the pattern drawings tacked to the wall. She did the thing people sometimes did when they had been holding a dismissive opinion about something, and the evidence in front of them was making that opinion uncomfortable, so she got very quiet for a moment. "Huh," she said finally. It was not an apology. It was not even a full acknowledgement. But it was the sound of a mind shifting slightly on its axis, which was all Abigail had ever expected from anyone. They went back inside and went back to work. The 17th children's set came off the work table on January 8th, 2 days ahead of schedule, and Abigail laid everything out on the kitchen table and looked at it and thought about the winter. Outside, the temperature had been dropping steadily for a week, the kind of dropping that was not random cold, but directional. The thermometer moving one way without coming back, degree by degree. The sky going a particular pale color that people who'd lived on the frontier for more than 2 seasons recognized as a sky with intention behind it. Clara had told her the last day she came to work that she'd seen that sky before. Once in her first year here, once 8 years ago. Both times the winter had turned genuinely dangerous. Not just cold, but the kind of cold that caught you in the open and didn't let go. "How long did it last?" Abigail had asked. "The first time 3 weeks. The second time," Clara had paused, 7 weeks. "We lost 4 people in the county. 2 of them were healthy." Abigail looked at the 23 pairs of mittens and 17 children's sets and 4 coat liners and 6 boot liners arranged on her kitchen table. It wasn't enough. Whatever was coming, it was not enough. She went to the barn and stood with the rabbits in the warm, animal-smelling air and did the math she'd been avoiding. She had pelts she hadn't yet processed. She had Angora fiber that could be blended into heavier items than she'd been making. She had patterns she'd designed but not cut yet. She had Clara's number and Ruth's number, and no guarantee either would come back on short notice. She went back inside and wrote 2 letters. Then she put on every layer she owned and walked to both their houses through weather that was starting, just starting, to have that particular still quality that precedes something serious. Clara opened her door and looked at Abigail standing on the porch in the cold and said, "I knew you were coming. I need 2 weeks, both of you, paid, full days." "What do you need made?" "Everything I have material for, whatever the supply allows." Clara pulled the door open wider. "Come in and show me the inventory." She did not ask what Abigail had seen in the sky or why she was moving with this particular kind of urgency. She didn't need to. Clara had lived here long enough to trust certain instincts, even when they came from a source she hadn't trusted before. Ruth said yes before Abigail had finished asking. They started the next morning. And 4 days later, the storm arrived. The storm came from the northwest, and it did not announce itself the way storms and stories do. No dramatic buildup, no rolling thunder, no single decisive moment where the sky changed and everyone looked up. It came the way the worst things came, quietly, and then all at once, so that by the time people understood what they were dealing with, the opportunity to prepare for it had already closed. Abigail was in the barn at first light on the morning it arrived, doing the water check, when she noticed that the wind had stopped. Complete stillness, which on the frontier in January was not peace, but the held breath before something exhaled. She stepped outside and looked north, and the horizon was a flat white gray that was not cloud so much as weather that had already made its decision and was simply in transit. She went back inside the barn and started filling every water vessel she had. By noon the snow had started. By mid-afternoon it was serious. By the time full dark came, the world outside her windows had reduced to approximately 6 feet of visibility in every direction and a sound that was less like wind and more like sustained pressure. A constant, low force pushing against the walls with the patience of something that had all the time it needed. She had brought 3 extra days of feed into the barn the day before. She had put extra wood on the porch. She had filled both the water barrel and every pot and bucket she owned. She had done all of this based on the particular quality of stillness she'd felt in the air and the color of that northern horizon. And now, sitting by the cook stove with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and the storm working at her house from every direction, she was grateful for instincts she hadn't known she had until she'd needed them. The rabbits were fine. The barn held warmth better than she'd expected. 64 warm bodies generated a meaningful amount of heat, and the gap in the north roofline that she and Eli had patched in October was holding. She had checked them twice before dark, and they were settled and calm in the way animals got when they understood that the person responsible for them was on top of things. She wasn't sure she was on top of things, but she was managing, which was often what on top of things actually meant. She couldn't get to town for 6 days, the first 2 days. The snow was still falling, and the drifts built up against the south side of the house to window height, and going out for anything beyond the barn was not a reasonable decision. The third day it stopped snowing, but the temperature dropped hard, the kind of drop that turned the snow surface to crust and made every breath hurt 3 inches past your lips. And she stayed close again, working in the house, spinning, stitching, moving through the production inventory she and Clara and Ruth had built up in the 2 weeks before the storm. She thought about other people. She couldn't help it. She thought about Dorothea Marsh's 17 children and whether they had the bootliners she'd delivered on January 8th, and whether the bootliners were enough. She thought about Thomas Dawson's hands and whether he'd had time to get his horses in properly. She thought about Clara, who lived alone since her husband had died 2 years ago, in a house she had described as drafty on the east wall. She thought about Margaret Hollis, which surprised her because Margaret Hollis had not been kind to her. But she thought about her anyway. About a woman who had probably never been genuinely cold in a dangerous way, and who might be right now learning what that felt like for the first time. On the 4th day, she dug herself out enough to get to the barn without fighting through a drift, and on the 6th day the temperature came up just enough. Not warm, nothing close to warm, but survivable in the open. That she got her coat and her boots and her rabbit-lined mittens, and she walked to the Dawson place. It took her 40 minutes on a road she normally covered in 15. The drifts in the low sections were past her knees, and she had to pick her way along the high edges where the wind had packed the snow hard enough to hold her weight. She fell twice. The second time she lay there in the snow, looking up at a sky that had gone a bright, brutal blue after the storm, and felt the cold of the ground coming up through her coat and decided she was going to get up now. She got up. Thomas Dawson opened the door before she reached the porch. He stood in the doorway with the warm light of the house behind him, and looked at her with an expression that was half relief and half something she couldn't read yet. "You walked?" he said. "Road's passable if you stay on the high edges," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. Her face had gone numb somewhere in the last quarter mile. He pulled the door wider. "Come in." The Dawson kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and Eli was at the table doing something with a length of rope, and Thomas's wife, Helen, was at the stove, and they both looked at Abigail coming in from the cold with that particular expression that people get when someone arrives from outside during a serious storm. Relief that tips into something grateful before they can stop it. "Sit down," Helen said. "I'll get coffee." Abigail sat. She pulled off her mittens and her hat and set them on the table, and Thomas sat across from her, and they looked at each other for a moment in the comfortable way of people who have an established and honest understanding. "How are the rabbits?" he asked. "Fine, warm. How are your horses?" "Got them in the day before. Lost one fence section on the north pasture." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "Hollis lost his storage barn. Roof came in under the snow weight." She closed her eyes briefly. That was a serious loss. "Anyone hurt?" "No, he was in the house." Thomas paused. "Granger's man came around 2 days in before the worst of it, collecting on debts. Couldn't get far. Turned back." Abigail looked at him. "Just thought you should know," he said quietly. She understood what he was telling her. Even in the middle of the worst storm in a decade, Silas Granger's operation was still moving, still pushing. The February 1st deadline had not paused for weather. She drank her coffee and didn't say anything about it, because there was nothing useful to say about it in this kitchen with the storm still heavy outside. What she said instead was, "Are there families in real trouble? Cold trouble, not just inconvenience trouble." Thomas and Helen exchanged a look. "The Prestons," Helen said. "They're in the low house on Mill Creek Road. Older construction. We've been worried." "The Vetter children," Thomas said. "4 of them. Youngest is 2. Their father's been sick since November, hasn't been able to put up proper wood stores." "Anyone else?" "Probably," Thomas said. "We don't know yet. Can't get to everyone." Abigail set down her cup. "I have inventory, finished goods, mittens, coat liners, children's sets. I have more than I've sold." She looked at Thomas directly. "If there are families who need them and can't afford them right now, I'll sort the payment out later." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing something complicated that she didn't try to interpret. "You sure about that?" "I'll figure out the money," she said. "I need to figure out how to get the items to people who need them." Getting the items to people who needed them turned out to be, in the conditions that existed on day 7 of the storm's aftermath, a collective problem that required a collective solution, which was something Abigail had not fully anticipated, and that the community of Clearwater Junction had not fully anticipated either. It started with Thomas and Eli loading her production inventory onto the Dawson sled on day 8, when the temperature was survivable and the road had been partially beaten down by the few people who'd ventured out the day before. They went first to the Prestons, because the Prestons were closest and most urgently reported. The Preston house was a low structure half buried in drift on 3 sides. And when Thomas knocked and the door opened, the air that came out was not dramatically cold, not dangerous, not quite, but it had the quality of a space that had been conserving heat carefully for days, where every blanket in the house was in use and the fire was being fed with the precise caution of people who were counting what they had left. Eleanor Preston was a woman in her 60s who had lived on the frontier for 40 years and who received everything with the same composed, practical expression as someone who had long ago decided that emotion was a luxury to be deployed carefully. She looked at what Abigail was carrying with this expression firmly in place. Then she opened the coat liner and held it for a moment, feeling what it was. The expression didn't change, but she said very quietly, "Come in." Her husband was in the main room wrapped in 2 blankets, the kind of old that lives in the joints rather than the face, and he had the careful stillness of a person managing pain with limited tools. He looked at Abigail without recognition. They'd never been formally introduced. And then at what she set on the table. "For the cold?" he said. "For the cold," she confirmed. She helped Eleanor fit the coat liner into her husband's coat, while Thomas added wood from the sled to their dwindling pile, and Eli quietly inventoried the water situation. Nobody discussed payment. Nobody discussed anything that wasn't immediate and practical, because the Prestons were people who understood practical language, and anything else would have been uncomfortable for everyone. When they left, Eleanor Preston stood in her doorway and watched them go. She didn't say thank you. She gave one short nod, which on the frontier was the same thing with more weight behind it. The Vetter children were a different kind of hard. The youngest one, the 2-year-old, was named Bess, and she was being held by her older sister, who could not have been more than 9. When the door opened, and the look on that 9-year-old's face was the specific look of a child who had been in charge of something she shouldn't have had to be in charge of, and was holding it together by the particular stubbornness that children develop when adults aren't available to be strong instead. Abigail had the children's sets in her pack, and she had them out before she was fully inside the door. The Vetter father, Jonas, was in bed with whatever had been working at him since November. Not dying, she could see that, but hollowed out the way long illness hollowed people, the kind of sick that took more from you than just the days you spent in bed. He watched from across the room while she knelt on the floor and fitted mittens onto 4 pairs of cold hands, and his expression was the expression of a man who was too exhausted to feel shame about needing help, but who was feeling it anyway. She didn't acknowledge the shame, not because she wasn't aware of it, but because acknowledging it would make it larger, and it was already large enough. The bootliners go in like this, she told the 9-year-old, whose name turned out to be Pearl. She showed her slowly, clearly, the way you show someone something you need them to be able to do themselves. Once they're in, you don't need to take them out until you're washing the boots, which won't be for a while. Pearl watched with complete attention. She had the eyes of someone who was storing everything away for use later. Can they get wet? The outside of the boot can. Don't let the liners get wet themselves if you can help it. If they do, take them out and dry them by the fire before you put them back. Pearl nodded. She was going to remember that, Abigail could tell. On the way out, Jonas Vetter said her name, said it quietly from across the room, and she stopped and looked at him. I've heard things about you, he said. His voice was rough from disuse. People saying you are foolish. People said that, yes. You're not foolish, he said, and closed his eyes. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she pulled it closed behind her and went back to the sled, and she did not think about what Jonas Vetter had said until later that night. And then she thought about it for a long time. By the time they got back to the main road, word had moved in the way that Frontier Word moved during a crisis. Not through announcement, but through the network of who had seen whom and who had heard what and who was watching from a window. From a window when the Dawson sled went past. 2 people flagged them down before they reached town. 3 more were waiting near the general store when they arrived. Margaret Hollis was one of them. She was standing on the general store porch in her coat, which was a good coat, heavier than most, and she had her arms crossed, and her expression was doing something that Abigail couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not exactly, but not comfortable either. Mrs. Hollis, Abigail said. You've been going to Holmes, Margaret said. It was not quite a question. Yes. With the rabbit things. With the warm things, yes. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. She looked at the sled, at the remaining inventory, at Abigail. My sister's family is on the Hartfield Road, 3 children. The youngest has always been sensitive to cold. More sensitive than normal. Abigail looked at her. How sensitive? She asked. Last winter, his fingers went white in 20 minutes. Doctor said it was some kind of circulation thing. He was 9 last winter. A pause. And in the pause was everything Margaret Hollis had not said to Abigail in that store weeks ago, and everything she was not going to say now either, but that was present in the particular way her shoulders were carrying themselves. He's 10 now. Abigail turned to the pack on the sled and found the smallest children's set she had, mittens, sized for a small 10-year-old, boot liners in the corresponding size. She held them out to Margaret. Margaret looked at them for a long moment. She took them with both hands, carefully. What do I owe you? She said. Nothing right now, Abigail said. Come see me when the road's better. Margaret Hollis nodded once, the same kind of nod Eleanor Preston had given her, and went inside, and Abigail turned back to the people waiting and kept working. It was on the 9th day that Silas Granger's man came back. His name was Aldous Fike, and he was not a bad man in the way that people who work for institutions are sometimes not bad themselves, but carry the institution's intentions as their own because it's what they're paid to do. He came on horseback with the collar of his coat turned up and an expression of professional discomfort that suggested he would rather be somewhere else but had a job to do. Abigail was in the barn when she heard the horse. She came out and found him in the yard, dismounting, his breath coming in visible clouds in the cold. Miss Rowan, he said. Mr. Fike, she said. She knew him well enough from the bank to use his name. She crossed her arms over her coat. He reached into his coat and produced a document, a newer, starker version of the one that had been delivered in November. The preliminary reminder having progressed into something with more formal language and a clearer timeline. He held it out. She took it. Read it. The language was exactly what she'd expected. The February 1st date, the specific amount, the consequences of non-payment laid out in the flat, certain language of legal instruments that existed specifically to remove doubt about what would happen if you didn't comply. Mr. Granger wanted me to confirm you received this personally, Aldous Fike said. Confirmed, she said. He shifted his weight. He looked at the barn door, at the faint sounds coming from inside. How are the animals doing? It was not, she thought, an entirely professional question. Aldous Fike had a daughter, she remembered. He had mentioned it in passing at the bank once, in the way people mentioned things when they were filling silence. A daughter around Pearl Vedder's age. They're well, she said. Warm. He nodded. Started to remount, then stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was doing something careful and professional, but had something underneath it that the professionalism wasn't quite covering. The families you've been visiting, he said. Fike Road goes past the Hartfield cutoff. I noticed the sled tracks. Abigail waited. My wife's parents are on Fike Road, he said. They're older. I haven't been able to get out there since the storm. I don't know if... He stopped. Rearranged. I don't suppose you have anything left in your inventory. She thought about the document he'd just handed her. The document with Silas Granger's name on it, and the date of February 1st and the amount she didn't have. Come to the barn, she said. She fitted him for his in-laws. An elderly couple, he said, both stiff in the joints. She had one coat liner panel left from the main inventory and a pair of the heaviest mittens she'd made, sized for larger hands than average. She wrapped them in cloth and handed them to him. He looked at the package and then at her, and something in his face was working very hard to stay professional. Miss Rowan, go see about your wife's parents, she said. We'll work out the rest later. He rode out, and she went back into the barn, and she sat on the stool near Harriet's hutch and felt the weight of the February 1st document in her coat pocket like a stone she hadn't asked to carry, but was carrying anyway. She had given away more than she'd sold. She had fed people through a storm with her own inventory and her own fuel and her own labor. And she had asked for very little in return because the people who'd needed it most had very little to give. She did not regret any of it. She was constitutionally incapable of regretting any of it, which was both her greatest asset and the thing that was currently going to cost her the homestead. She scratched behind Harriet's ears, which Harriet endured with the gracious condescension she brought to most physical affection. Working on it, Abigail told her. Orders began arriving on day 10. Not in person. The roads were still difficult enough that coming to the homestead was a commitment, but in the form of notes delivered by whoever happened to be passing, folded pieces of paper with handwriting that ranged from careful to barely legible, all saying variations of the same thing. I heard you made the things that kept the Dawson children warm. Can you make a pair for my husband's hands? The Reverend's wife said you have boot liners. My mother can't feel her feet below 30 degrees. How many do you have? My neighbor showed me what you made. I want 3 pairs for my family. I can pay. She put them on the kitchen table and read through them one at a time and then read through them again. 14 notes by day 12. 22 by day 15. She stopped counting somewhere in the 3rd week and started a proper order ledger instead, because at some point the notes were no longer a hopeful sign and had become a logistical problem that needed actual management. Clara came back on day 13, uninvited, with her coat on and her sewing kit in hand, and an expression that was not quite apology, but was working in that direction. I'm assuming you need help, she said at the door. Come in, Abigail said. Ruth came the next day. And then, on day 15, a woman Abigail had never spoken to, a farm wife named Gertrude Oakes, who lived on the South Road, and who had, by her own account, been watching the situation develop from a careful distance, appeared at the door and said she had been sewing leather and hide work for 15 years and understood she might be useful. Abigail looked at her for a moment. Have you worked with pelt before? My grandfather was a trapper, Gertrude said. I grew up helping with the processing. Abigail opened the door wider. The kitchen became a production room in earnest. 4 women at the table and the sideboard and the folding work surface Abigail had built from scrap lumber, and the sound of the house changed, became fuller, louder, the particular sound of people working together towards something, which was different from the sound of one person working alone even when both sounds involved the same tools. Abigail managed the production schedule and the inventory and the order ledger and the fiber processing. Clara handled speed cutting and heavy sewing. Ruth did detail work and finishing. Gertrude took over all the pelt preparation, which freed up 2 hours a day that Abigail had been spending on work she was competent at, but not fast at. They talked. They fought, once, mildly, about the right way to finish a seam on hide work, which was resolved when Gertrude demonstrated her method, and it was visibly faster. Clara made coffee without being asked, and made too much of it, and nobody complained. Ruth brought her youngest child one afternoon because there was no one to watch her at home, and the little girl sat in the corner and played quietly, and at one point climbed into Abigail's lap while Abigail was doing paperwork and fell asleep, which was the kind of thing that happened when people worked together long enough that the formal edges of the arrangement wore down. Abigail sat very still for the 20 minutes the child slept, doing her paperwork one-handed, and felt something she didn't quite have a name for. Not maternal, exactly. Not longing, exactly. Something that was the experience of being trusted by something small and warm and completely unguarded, which turned out to be a specific thing she hadn't known she was missing until she had it for 20 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in January. The production numbers, once she laid them out in the ledger at the end of the third week, were remarkable in the way that things were remarkable when you had been too busy doing them to see them clearly. 47 completed pairs of mittens, 19 coat liner panels, 22 children's sets, which was more than the original Marsh order because Ruth had cut, and Gertrude had finished 6 additional sets from pelt pieces that would otherwise have been too small to use individually, but could be seamed. 11 boot liners. 4 complete hat and muffler sets made from Angora blend yarn that Abigail had spun herself in the evenings when her hands were too tired for the detailed work, but still needed to be doing something. Revenue, at her pricing, from the paid orders. Enough. Not enough for the full February payment, but enough for a significant portion of it. When she added the amount she'd extended credit on, the families she'd supplied with the understanding that payment would come when the roads opened and people had access to what they had, the numbers closed. Almost. Not quite. She sat with the ledger and the February 1st document side by side on the kitchen table on the night of January 22nd and did the arithmetic 4 times because she kept hoping she'd made an error somewhere. She had not made an error. She was short, not by an enormous amount in the abstract, but an enormous amount in the context of what she had, which was this land and these animals and 4 women who had come to work with her and a boy who came on Saturdays, and the knowledge, hard-won, and currently sitting in her chest like something she couldn't put down, that she had been right about all of it. She had been right. The rabbits had saved people through a winter that would have hurt them without what she'd made. The East Field was going to come up in spring, and it was going to produce. She had built something real and workable and valuable from 64 animals that Dolph Marsh had been going to take to the butcher, and she was still going to lose the homestead. Because being right did not automatically translate into having enough money in the right place at the right time, which was one of the crueler mechanical facts of the world she lived in. She sat there for a long time. Then Eli knocked on the door, which surprised her because it was late and cold and she had not expected anyone. She opened it. He was standing on the porch in his coat with his hat pulled low, and he had an expression she had never seen on him before, determined in the way of someone who has done something they weren't sure they should do and has passed the point of being able to undo it. "I talk to people," he said. She looked at him. "What people?" "People who owe you, the ones you gave things to on credit during the storm. I told them the date." He met her eyes directly. "February 1st. I told them what would happen if you missed it." Abigail opened her mouth and then closed it. "I know you didn't want to ask anyone," he said. "You weren't going to ask anyone." His jaw was set in the way she recognized, the way he looked when he'd thought something through and was standing by it. "But I talked to them, and most of them said they'd figure out a way to pay before February." She stood in the open doorway with the cold coming in around them both. "Eli," she said, "I know you might be mad." "I'm not mad." "Okay." "I would not have asked," she said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "But they want to. That's the part you weren't accounting for. They actually want to." She stood with that for a moment, the wanting to. The idea that the people she had gone to in the worst week of that winter, the Prestons, the Vetters, the families on the Hartfield Road, had enough that they wanted to return something, and had just been waiting for someone to make it possible to do that. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in. She made coffee. They sat at the table with the ledger and the February 1st document between them, and they looked at the numbers together, and the numbers were still the numbers, still short, still the same problem she'd been sitting with before he knocked, but the problem had a different shape now. The payments started coming in on January 24th, not all at once, and not easily. The roads were still difficult, and some people sent what they had rather than what they owed, with notes explaining the difference would follow. And some people sent more than they owed because they had done their own arithmetic and understood what the shortfall was. But they came. Thomas Dawson came in person on the 24th with cash and a handshake and nothing sentimental about it because Thomas Dawson was not a sentimental man. Eleanor Preston sent her payment via the mail rider with a note that was 3 words. Here is mine. Jonas Vetter, still sick, sent Pearl on foot through the remaining snow to deliver an envelope that Pearl handed to Abigail with the gravity of a child carrying something important, which she was. Abigail counted the envelope's contents and looked at Pearl. How did your father get this? He sold the good saw, Pearl said. He said tools can be replaced and some things can't. Abigail looked at this 9-year-old standing in her kitchen, and she put the money in the ledger carefully, and she did not make a thing of it. On January 27th, Dorothea Marsh arrived with the remaining balance on the children's sets, plus an additional amount that she described, without elaborating, as a contribution from several members of the congregation who had heard about the situation and made their own decision about it. Abigail looked at the amount. Dorothea. Don't, Dorothea said quietly. Let people do the right thing. It's good for them. By January 29th, she was close. Not there, but close enough that close felt like its own kind of cruelty. The distance between where you were and where you needed to be made smaller by everything that people had done, and yet still distance. The missing amount was not large, in the way that amounts that could change everything were often not large in absolute terms. It was the gap between a story that ended one way and a story that ended another, and it was sitting on January 29th with 2 days left in Abigail's hands going through the motions of the work, while her mind was somewhere else entirely. Clara came that morning and sat down and pulled out her sewing without looking at Abigail. Ruth came an hour later. Gertrude came at noon. None of them said anything about the date. They just worked. And at 3 in the afternoon on January 29th, someone knocked on the door who Abigail had not expected and had not called for. And when she opened it, the cold came in first and then the person standing in it. And the person was not who she had expected at all. It was Aldous Fike. He had a coat on that was not a bank coat, not the formal one he wore when he came on Granger's business. He was in working clothes, the kind of coat a man wore when he had not come in any professional capacity, and he was carrying something in his hand that he held out to her before he said a word. An envelope. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at him. My wife, he said, and my wife's parents. And he stopped, worked through something, continued. Some others. People who found out what was happening. Some of them you helped during the storm. Some of them just knew. He pushed the envelope slightly toward her. It's not from the bank. It has nothing to do with the bank. She took it. She looked inside. It was enough. Plus a little more than enough, which she would return to whoever had contributed it, she told herself immediately, and meant it, because she did not want a cent more than she was owed and had not asked for a cent at all. She stood in the doorway with the envelope in her hand and the cold coming in and Aldous Fike standing there looking not quite like a bank employee and not quite like a private citizen and something in the middle that did not have a clean name. Tell them thank you, she said. Tell them yourself, he said. Most of them are in town. She looked at him. Clara's husband's wagon is available, he said carefully, if you need to get to the bank before it closes tomorrow. Behind her, Clara had stopped sewing. Ruth had stopped. Gertrude had stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Clara said, in the perfectly even tone she used when she was not going to make a big thing of something, I'll drive. Clara drove like a woman who had been navigating frontier roads in winter her entire adult life, which she had, and who considered excessive caution to be its own kind of danger, which she also did. The wagon moved at a pace that Abigail would have described as ambitious given the road conditions, but Clara had her horses and her road, and she knew both of them in the specific way that came from 23 years of the same terrain in every kind of weather, so Abigail sat beside her and held the envelope and did not say anything about the speed. Ruth and Gertrude were in the wagon bed behind them. None of them had discussed whether to come. They had simply put on their coats. Eli had appeared at the door just as they were leaving, breathless from running from wherever he'd been, and had climbed into the wagon bed without asking permission, which nobody objected to. The road into Clearwater Junction was better than it had been a week ago. The main route had been worked by enough traffic to pack the snow into something navigable. But the cold was still serious, and the sky had that particular winter clarity that meant no more weather coming, but also no warmth coming either, a sky that was beautiful in the way of things that did not care about you. Abigail sat with the envelope in her coat pocket and her hands in her rabbit-lined mittens, and she thought about what she was going to say to Silas Granger. She had been thinking about it in the way she thought about things. Not obsessively, not anxiously, but steadily, the way you think about a problem that needs solving when you have enough information to work with and enough quiet to let the thinking happen. She had a payment. She had the full amount plus what she intended to return. She was not going in to negotiate or to apologize or to explain herself. She was going in to pay what she owed and have it recorded and walk out with her homestead intact. What she did not know was how Silas Granger was going to receive that. She had never spoken to him at length. She had met him twice. Once when she'd taken out the loan, which had been a formal and entirely impersonal transaction handled mostly through paperwork, and once in passing at the general store when he had looked at her the way men who did not expect much from women looked at women who had not yet proven them wrong. She had formed an impression of him that was neither positive nor negative. A cautious man, a man who thought in terms of risk and return, a man who ran his institution conservatively and believed in the fundamental reliability of numbers over people. She understood that kind of thinking. She had used it herself. What she also understood, and suspected Granger did not, was that numbers were always downstream of decisions that people had made, which meant that understanding people was actually the prior skill and the numbers were just how you kept score. She would find out shortly which version of Silas Granger showed up to this particular reckoning. The bank was on the main street of Clearwater Junction in a building that was more substantial than most of the others around it, which was deliberate. Banks on the frontier were in the business of communicating permanence, and the 2-inch thick oak door and the stone facing on the lower half of the exterior were doing that work as plainly as any sign. Abigail had always found this kind of architectural argument slightly comic, the way institutions used materials to say things they didn't want to say out loud. She climbed down from the wagon. Clara tied the horses. Ruth and Gertrude climbed out of the bed and stamped their feet against the cold. Eli dropped down last and stood slightly behind Abigail's shoulder in the way he sometimes positioned himself when he understood a situation was significant without being entirely sure what his role in it was. Abigail looked at the door. Then she pushed it open and went in. The interior of Granger's bank was warm and smelled of wood polish and paper and the particular dryness of a room with a good stove and no moisture. And the young man at the front desk looked up from whatever he was doing with the startled expression of someone who had not expected the door to open with that kind of intention behind it. He recovered quickly, the way bank employees trained to recover quickly. "Miss Rowan," he said, which meant he knew who she was, which she filed away. "I need to see Mr. Granger," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. Tell him Abigail Rowan is here to make a payment on the Clearwater homestead loan. Tell him she'd like to do it today rather than waiting until February 1st, and that she'd like to discuss the terms of the remaining balance." She said it the way she said things when she needed them to land clearly. Not loudly, not aggressively, just with the particular quality of someone who has decided exactly what they need and is not going to be redirected from it by ambient institutional friction. The young man went. He was gone for 2 minutes, which was long enough for Abigail to be aware of Clara standing 1 step behind her right shoulder, and Ruth 1 step behind her left, and Gertrude behind them, and Eli at the back, and she did not turn around to look at any of them because she did not need to. She knew they were there. The young man came back. "He'll see you." Silas Granger's office was a room that had been organized to communicate authority, which was something offices at a certain level of institutional power did, whether the person in them intended it or not. The large desk, the chair positioned slightly higher than the chairs for visitors, the documents arranged in a way that suggested constant productive activity. Granger himself was standing when she came in, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to be seated, to make her come to him across the room. That he was standing meant something, though she wasn't sure yet what. He was older than she'd recalled, or maybe she was seeing him more clearly in this context. Late 50s, she thought, a man who had been careful with himself the way careful men were, who showed the years in his posture more than his face, a slight forward lean that came from decades of desk work. His eyes were sharp in the way that the eyes of men who worked with numbers were often sharp, good at rapid assessment, not always good at what to do with the assessment once they'd made it. He looked at her. He looked at Clara and Ruth and Gertrude and Eli in the doorway behind her. His expression processed all of this without giving much back. Miss Rowan, he said. Mr. Granger. She crossed the room and sat down in the visitor's chair without being invited to, which she did deliberately. She put the envelope on his desk. That's the installment amount plus the current interest as of today's date. I've calculated it from the loan document, but I'd like your figure confirmed. He looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up immediately. He sat down in his own chair and regarded her with the expression of a man who had been expecting this meeting to go one way and was recalibrating. You have the full amount, he said. It was not quite a question. I have the full current installment. The remaining principal and future installments are what I'd like to discuss. He picked up the envelope then, opened it, counted it with the practiced speed of a man who counted money the way other people read, and set it on the desk in front of him. This is correct, he said. I assumed it would be. She folded her hands in her lap. I want to talk to you about the structure of the remaining payments. Granger looked at her steadily. The structure is in the loan document. I know what's in the loan document. I'm asking you to look at what I've built and consider whether the existing structure serves either of us well going forward. She kept her voice level and her hands still. I have a functioning business. I have 47 completed orders in the last 3 weeks. I have a backlog of orders that will take through March to fill. I have a spring planting coming on a field that has been properly amended for the first time in 3 seasons. I am not a failing venture. I was a venture that needed time to prove itself, and the last 6 weeks have been that proof. Granger said nothing. He was listening, which was better than she'd expected. If you restructure the repayment timeline, extend it by 6 months, adjust the installment amounts to match my actual revenue cycle rather than an arbitrary calendar, you get paid in full with interest. If you foreclose, you get a homestead with depleted soil, a rabbit barn, and a barn full of animals nobody in this county has figured out how to use yet. You've seen my order numbers. You know what that operation is worth to this community. She paused. And you have a man working for you who came to me in the middle of a blizzard to ask for help for his wife's parents. You can draw your own conclusions about what that says about the value of this homestead to the people around it. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out because it was true, and because she thought Granger was a man who responded to true things stated plainly. And she was right, because she saw something in his expression shift at the mention of Aldous Fike. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the envelope on his desk. He looked at her. You came here with one payment, he said. That's not enough to restructure a loan. No, it's enough to demonstrate I can make payments. The restructuring is the conversation we're having right now. You don't have a lawyer. I don't need a lawyer to have a conversation. I can get one before I sign anything. A very slight pause. She thought she saw something move in his expression that was not quite amusement, but was in that direction. The expression of a man encountering something he hadn't anticipated and finding, despite himself, that he respected it. Show me the order numbers, he said. She had them. She had known she would need them, so she had written them out clearly on a piece of paper she'd put in her other coat pocket, not in the envelope, separate, so that the money and the business case arrived as distinct things. She put the paper on his desk. He read it. His eyes moved through the numbers at that same rapid pace. She watched his face and did not see what she'd feared, which was the dismissive compression that would have meant he'd already decided. Instead, she saw the particular stillness of a man who was doing actual arithmetic. 47 units in 3 weeks, he said, in addition to what I'd already sold before the storm. I have the full ledger. I can bring it. What's your backlog? As of this morning, 63 orders. Some of them are full family sets. I have 3 women working with me, and I'm looking for a 4th. He set the paper down, looked at it for another moment, then looked at her. The rabbit fiber, he said. That's the primary material? Angora fiber for yarn production and blended items. Rex and mixed breed pelt for lining work. Rabbit manure for field amendment. She kept her voice matter-of-fact. The spring planting will add a second revenue stream that doesn't depend on the fiber work at all. By next fall, I'll have both. Granger leaned back in his chair slightly. It was a small movement, but it meant something. The posture of a man who was no longer in defensive position. You're telling me the rabbits are doing 3 things at once? Yes. I told Aldous in November that you were going to default. She did not say anything. He disagreed with me, Granger said. It sounded like the disagreement had been notable enough to remember. He said, he paused, chose his words. He said, you weren't the kind of person who bought things she didn't understand. Abigail thought about Aldous Fike standing in her yard with the foreclosure notice, asking if she had anything left for his wife's elderly parents. "He's a good judge," she said. Granger picked up the envelope again and set it in the tray to his right, which was the tray for things that had been dealt with. She recognized the filing habit from the bank visit in September. "I'll need to look at the full ledger and the field amendment records, and I want to see the order backlog documented, not just told to me." Her heart did something she didn't let show on her face. "I can have all of that here by the end of the week. I'll want my man to come out and look at the property." "When?" "Monday, if the road holds." "I'll be there." He picked up a pen. He wrote something on a piece of paper, she couldn't see what, and set it face down on the desk. "I'm not promising anything, Miss Rowan. I'm agreeing to look at the full picture. That's all I'm asking for," she said. Which was true, and was also, she understood, exactly the right thing to say to a man who had already started to change his mind, but needed to feel that the decision was his. She stood. He stood, the same as when she'd come in, and for a moment they were just two people standing in an office on a winter afternoon with the whole thing still unresolved but pointing somewhere different than it had been an hour ago. "The work you did during the storm," he said, not quite casually, but reaching for it. "Aldous told me about the families you went to." She picked up her coat from the chair arm. "Winter on the frontier is serious business." "It is," he said. "Most people treat that as a reason to look after their own." She put her coat on. "Most people, yes." She left the office and walked through the bank lobby where Clara and Ruth and Gertrude and Eli were waiting, and she did not say anything until they were outside in the cold with the door closed behind them. Then Clara said, "Well?" "Monday," Abigail said. "His man comes Monday to look at everything. He wants the full ledger and the records." Clara looked at her. "And after that?" "After that, we'll see." What happened between Thursday and Monday was something that Abigail was never entirely able to account for, because it moved through the community of Clearwater Junction in channels she hadn't organized and couldn't fully trace after the fact. It started, she thought, with Thomas Dawson. Thomas had a particular quality in Clearwater Junction that had nothing to do with wealth or formal position. He was simply a man that other men trusted, the way that certain people in small communities accumulated credibility through years of being straightforward and showing up and not making promises they didn't keep. When Thomas Dawson said something was worth paying attention to, people in Clearwater Junction paid attention to it. What Thomas said, apparently, beginning sometime on Friday, was that Silas Granger was looking at Abigail Rowan's operation on Monday, and that people who had something to say about the value of that operation to the community might want to say it before Monday, rather than after. She heard this secondhand from Eli, who heard it from his father directly. "He said that?" she asked. "He said, and I'm getting this right," Eli had the focused expression he got when he was trying to be precise. "He said that a banker who was reconsidering his position ought to hear from the people his bank served before he finished reconsidering." Abigail thought about that for a moment. "Your father's more strategic than he lets on." "He doesn't let on much," Eli agreed. By Saturday, she was hearing reports of conversations happening in town, at the general store, at the feed store, at the places where people intersected in the way people in small communities did. She heard that Jonas Vetter had written a letter, which was significant because Jonas Vetter was still sick and writing a letter had cost him something. She heard that Dorothea Marsh had spoken to the women in her congregation with the particular quiet directness that made Dorothea Marsh someone people listened to. She heard that Eleanor Preston had said something to someone at the feed store that had been brief and definitive, and that the person she'd said it to had repeated it to at least 4 others. She did not hear what Eleanor Preston had said. She thought about asking and decided she would rather not know, because knowing might make her feel things she didn't have time to feel right now. What she did instead was prepare. She organized the ledger into the clearest possible form. Every transaction, every order, every date and amount and name, cross-referenced with her production log. She pulled together the field amendment records she'd been keeping since October, which were more thorough than she'd realized until she spread them out. Soil observations, amendment quantities, the visible changes in the field's color and texture, and moisture retention over 3 months. She documented the Angora harvest cycles with the dates and yields from each of the 3 animals. She wrote up the order backlog in full, with names and amounts and expected completion dates. She did all of this on Friday and Saturday, and on Sunday morning she spread it on the kitchen table and read through all of it and found it good. Not perfect, not without gaps, but honest and thorough, and the picture of something real. Gertrude came on Sunday afternoon and found her at the table. "You're going to be fine," Gertrude said, looking at the documentation spread out in front of Abigail. "I might be fine," Abigail said. "I don't know yet." "You're going to be fine," Gertrude repeated, with the flat certainty she brought to all her opinions, and went to make coffee. Granger's man came Monday morning at 9 o'clock. His name was Warren Hess, and he was younger than Abigail expected. Mid-30s, precise in the way of someone who had trained himself to be precise and was proud of it. And he came with a clipboard and a measuring tape and the professional expression of a man whose job was to see things clearly and not get personally involved in what he saw. He walked the east field first. She took him out there and stood back while he looked at the soil, and she watched him crouch down and take a handful and feel it the way people who knew soil felt it. Not decoratively, but diagnostically, rubbing it between his fingers, looking at the color, checking the moisture level in the lower layer under the frost surface. He stood up and wrote something on his clipboard. She didn't ask what. He walked the south quarter next, and then came back through the yard and looked at the barn from the outside before he went in. He spent 20 minutes in the barn. She walked him through the hutch system and the collection trays and the fiber processing setup, and she answered his questions directly and without embellishment. And when he asked about the Angora harvest, she showed him the records, and when he asked about the field amendment quantities, she showed him those too. He did not say much. He wrote things on the clipboard. At 11 o'clock, he came into the house and sat at the kitchen table and went through the ledger. He was fast with it, faster than she expected, which meant he was better at this than his youth suggested. He went through twice, cross-checking things, which she took as professionalism rather than doubt. He put down the ledger and looked at the order backlog documentation. 63 orders, he said. As of Thursday, I've had 4 more since then. He wrote something. At current production rate, 3 weeks to clear the existing backlog at current capacity. If I add a 4th worker, which I'm looking to do, 2 weeks. And the spring planting? She had a plan for the spring planting laid out separately, and she handed it to him. He read it with the same focused speed. These yield estimates are ambitious. They're based on comparable amended soil yields from 2 agricultural pamphlets I have on file. I can show you the sources. He looked at her for the first time with something that was not entirely professional. You kept agricultural pamphlets. I keep everything I might need, she said. He muttered a sound that was not quite a laugh and wrote something else on his clipboard. He closed it. He looked around the kitchen, at the production setup, the work table, the organized material storage, and then at her. I'm going to be honest with you, he said. Please, she said. When Mr. Granger sent me out here, I expected to document a property that looked good on paper because someone was desperate to make it look good on paper. That's most of what I see in this job. He tapped his clipboard. This is different. The documentation is consistent with what I'm looking at in the field and the barn. The order volume is verifiable through the names. The soil work is visible. He paused. The rabbit situation is the strangest thing I've seen in 3 years of property assessments, but it's working. Abigail kept her face neutral. Is that going in your report? He almost smiled, professionally phrased. I'm sure you'll find the right language, she said. He stood, gathered his things, and stopped at the door. There were people in town this week, he said, talking about this property. I heard about it before I came out. She waited. Mr. Granger heard about it too, he said. A lot of people had things to say. I didn't ask them to, she said. No, that's the part Mr. Granger noticed. He opened the door. He'll be in touch by Wednesday. Wednesday came slowly. She worked through Monday and Tuesday with the particular discipline of a person who has decided that working is better than waiting and has committed to that decision completely. The orders didn't care about the bank. The rabbits didn't care about the bank. Harriet had an opinion about the timing of her morning feeding that she expressed vocally and persistently, and that was, in its way, one of the more grounding experiences of those 2 days. The complete indifference of 64 animals to the administrative situation their keeper was navigating. Clara and Ruth worked both days. They did not mention the bank assessment. They talked about the work, about the orders, about a technical problem with the seaming on one of the heavier coat liners that Gertrude had spotted, and that they spent a better part of Tuesday solving. Ruth's youngest came again on Tuesday and fell asleep in the same corner, in the same position, as if she had a reserved spot. Normal things. The texture of a life continuing. On Tuesday evening, after Clara and Ruth had gone, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the order ledger and a cup of tea that went cold while she wasn't paying attention, and let herself feel, for a while, the full weight of the uncertainty. Not productively, not trying to think through it, not trying to calculate outcomes, just sitting with it the way you sometimes had to sit with things you couldn't control. She was afraid. She was aware of being afraid in the specific way that she was aware of most things, clearly, without performing anything about it to herself. She was afraid of losing the homestead, of losing the field that was coming back to life, and the barn that had 64 animals in it, and the production operation that 4 women had built together over the last month. She was afraid in the practical way, not the existential way, not afraid of what it meant about her worth or her choices or her life, but afraid of the actual concrete loss of the actual concrete thing she had built. She let herself be afraid for the evening. Then she went to bed. Granger's letter arrived Wednesday morning, delivered by Aldous Fike himself, which told her something before she opened it. Aldous looked, she thought, like a man who knew what was in the letter and was maintaining professional neutrality about it with some effort. He handed it to her at the door and said, "Good morning, Miss Rowan," and she said, "Good morning, Mr. Fike," and she did not ask him anything because that was not how this worked, and they both understood that. She waited until he was back on his horse and riding out before she opened it. The letter was written in Granger's own hand, not the formal typewritten language of the preliminary notices. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing was that it was longer than she'd expected. He opened with a direct acknowledgement of the payment received, formal language, properly recorded. Then he moved to the assessment results, which Warren Hess had apparently written up and delivered Tuesday afternoon. He quoted specific figures from the assessment: field amendment progress, fiber yield projections, order volume, estimated annual revenue at current trajectory. The numbers were accurate. Hess had been thorough. Then the letter changed tone. Not dramatically. Granger was not a dramatic writer, but she could feel the place where he had stopped writing the institutional letter and started writing a different one. He wrote that he had received, over the course of the past week, a number of communications from residents of Clearwater County regarding the Clearwater Homestead operation and its impact on the community during the recent storm event. He wrote that the volume and specificity of these communications had been, and he used this word, notable. He wrote that several of the communications had come from people he had known for many years, and whose judgment he respected, and that the picture they described of events during the worst week of the storm was consistent with the documentation his assessment had found. That is to say, it was a picture of something real, not constructed. She sat down on the porch step to read the next part, even though it was cold, because she needed to not be standing. He wrote that after reviewing the assessment and considering the community input, he was prepared to offer a restructuring of the loan terms, extended timeline, revised installment amounts tied to actual revenue cycles rather than arbitrary calendar dates, with a performance review at 6 months. He listed the revised terms clearly and in full. They were reasonable, more than reasonable, she thought. They were the terms of a man who had changed his mind, not reluctantly, but genuinely. At the end, a single paragraph that was not bank language at all. He wrote, "I have been in this business for 30 years, and I have made assessments of properties and people that I was confident in and that turned out to be wrong. I am writing to say that my initial assessment of the Clearwater Homestead operation was one of those. The business case is sound. The community impact is documented. I should have seen both earlier, and I did not. The revised terms are offered without conditions beyond those stated above." She sat on the porch step with the letter in her hands, and the cold coming through her coat, and the barn sounds from behind the yard, and she read that last paragraph 2 more times. Then she put the letter in her coat pocket and sat there for a little longer, not doing anything. She was not crying. She was not victorious. She was not the feeling she'd anticipated. There was no dramatic release, no sudden lightness. What she felt was something quieter and more durable than those things. A settling. The particular physical sensation of a weight that had been present so long you'd stop noticing it separately from yourself, suddenly gone, so that the absence was what you felt, and you had to relearn what you felt like without it. She sat with that for a while. Then she went inside, put on a fresh pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the revised terms and worked through them line by line, because she needed to understand exactly what she was agreeing to before she agreed to anything, and also because working through something line by line was what she did, and doing what she did was how she had gotten here, and she was not going to stop now. She was still at the table when Eli came through the door at noon, which he did without knocking because by this point, neither of them observed that particular formality with any consistency. He saw the letter on the table and he looked at her face and he said nothing for a moment, reading the situation. "Good or bad?" he said. "Good," she said. "Come look." He sat across from her and she pushed the letter toward him and he read it. She watched his face as he read, saw the careful attention, the slight narrowing of his eyes at the financial terms, the pause at the last paragraph. He put the letter down. He looked at her. He apologized, Eli said. He said it not with triumph, but with something that was closer to surprise. The surprise of a 14-year-old discovering that adults occasionally did things he hadn't expected them to do. "He did," she said. "Do you believe him?" She picked up her coffee, which had gone lukewarm. "I think he meant it. I think he's a man who changed his mind and isn't comfortable pretending he didn't." Eli nodded slowly. He looked at the revised terms. "So you're keeping it?" "I'm keeping it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My father's going to want to know." "Tell him. Tell Clara and Ruth and Gertrude, too. They should know." "What are you going to do today?" He asked it the way he asked practical questions. Not what are you feeling, not what does this mean, but what are you going to do, which was the right question. Abigail set down her coffee. She looked around the kitchen, at the production materials, the order ledger, the documentation stacked neatly from the assessment, the spinning wheel with its wobble in the drive wheel that she'd been meaning to get looked at for months. "There are 63 orders," she said. 67 now, I think. The spring planting plan needs to be finalized before the ground thaws. I need to talk to a fourth worker. She looked at him. "And Harriet has been off her feed for 2 days, which I haven't mentioned to anyone because I didn't want one more thing, but I need to figure out what's wrong with her." Eli's expression shifted into the particular focus he brought to animal problems, which was one of the things she valued most about him. Off her feed how? Eating less, not moving as much. Could be stress, could be early pregnancy, could be something I'm not catching yet. He stood up. "I'll go look at her." "The coffee's still on," she said. I was already heading for the door. She heard him pull it open and head across the yard toward the barn, and she sat at the table alone in the warm kitchen with the restructured loan letter and the order ledger and the spring planting plan and the cold coffee. And outside the barn door swung open and shut. And inside the barn, Harriet was waiting to be examined by a 14-year-old who had learned to do it properly over 4 months of Saturday mornings, and the east field was under snow that would break in 6 weeks. And underneath the snow, the soil was different than it had been in September, changed by the patient work of 64 animals who had never asked to be part of anyone's plan, but had ended up at the center of one anyway. She picked up her pen and opened the order ledger to the next blank page. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And for the first time since September, the work had a foundation under it that she knew was going to hold. She started writing. Harriet was pregnant. Eli figured it out in 20 minutes. Which was faster than Abigail would have managed because she had been looking at Harriet with eyes that were too close to the situation. She had been worried about illness, about stress, about something going wrong, and worry had narrowed her attention in exactly the wrong direction. Eli looked at Harriet with the fresh eyes of someone who had no emotional investment in a particular diagnosis, and he came back into the kitchen and said, "She's not sick, she's nesting." With the calm delivery of a boy who had grown up around animals and understood that bodies did what they did regardless of whether the timing was convenient. Abigail stared at him. "The buck enclosure has been separate since November." "Apparently not separate enough," Eli said. "At some point in November." She thought back. There had been a day in early November. She remembered it specifically now, the way you remembered things after the fact that you hadn't paid enough attention to at the time. When the divider between 2 sections of the hutch system had come loose on one corner, and she had fixed it the same evening without thinking too much about whether anything had happened in the hours it had been loose. Something had happened. "How far along?" she asked. "I don't know exactly, but she's pulling fur. Could be a week, could be less." Abigail sat down. She was not distressed. Angora does were capable mothers, and the barn was warm enough, and she had the materials for a nesting box. But this was new territory, and new territory on top of everything else that was happening had a particular quality of density to it, like another weight being placed on a scale that was already fully loaded. "How many kits does an Angora typically have?" Eli asked. "Between 4 and 8, average around 5 or 6. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "If she has 5 or 6 Angora kits, and they're healthy, and I can breed them out deliberately over the next generation, She stopped herself. She was getting ahead of things. Harriet had not yet delivered. The kits might not all survive. She had never raised Angora kits before, and there was a meaningful difference between knowing something theoretically and doing it in practice. One thing at a time, she said to herself as much as to Eli. Right, he said. He sat down across from her. But if it works out, she said, the fiber operation grows faster than I'd planned, significantly faster. She picked up her pen. Help me fix the nesting box dimensions. I need to get it built today. They built it that afternoon, and Harriet regarded the finished product with the imperious evaluation she brought to everything, sniffed it twice, and began rearranging the nesting material with the specific purposefulness of an animal who had decided to accept an offering while making clear that certain improvements could have been made to the design. Abigail watched her and felt the strange, complicated tenderness that Harriet consistently provoked. This difficult, opinionated, completely irreplaceable animal who had been the first to show her what the fiber could actually do, sitting in a box that Abigail had built, doing something ancient and independent and entirely her own. She's going to be fine, Eli said. She's always fine, Abigail said. She makes a point of it. The kits arrived on a Thursday, 6 days after Eli's diagnosis, in the early morning hours when Abigail was doing the water check. 6 of them, all healthy, all with the characteristic long fur even at birth that told her clearly they had inherited their mother's genetics, rather than whatever the buck had contributed in his brief window of opportunity. She sat on the barn floor next to the nesting box for a long time, just watching them, which was not something she often allowed herself. Time spent watching things rather than doing things. But some things warranted the stillness. 6 Angora kits. If even 4 of them survived to harvest age, her fiber production would nearly double within the year. If she managed a deliberate breeding program from there, the increase was geometric. She could see the whole thing from where she was sitting on the cold barn floor. Not just what it was now, but what it could become over 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, if she was patient and careful and did not try to go faster than the animal's natural timeline allowed. She had always been good at seeing forward. It was what had brought her here. It was also what had made the hard months harder, because the distance between what she could see coming and what existed right now had sometimes felt like the kind of distance that defeats people. But the kits were here, warm and alive, and the field was under snow that was slowly losing its grip on the ground as February moved toward March, and the orders were coming in, and the work was real, and the loan was restructured, and Harriet was a mother who was handling the situation with characteristic authority. She was still sitting there when the barn door opened and Clara came in early, earlier than her usual time, and found her. Clara looked at the nesting box. She looked at Abigail on the floor. She sat down on the stool without saying anything and looked at the kits for a moment. 6, she said. 6, Abigail confirmed. Clara nodded once, the nod she used when something confirmed what she'd already decided to think. That changes the math. It changes a lot of things, Abigail said. They sat in the barn together in the early morning cold, with the kits making small sounds, and Harriet keeping her calm, watchful attention on both of them, and neither woman said anything else for a few minutes, which was the kind of quiet that only existed between people who had worked alongside each other long enough to be comfortable inside it. Then Clara said, "Ruth wants to talk to you about something." Abigail looked at her. "What something? She should tell you herself." Clara stood up and brushed straw off her coat. "But I think you should hear it today." What Ruth wanted to say took her a while to get to, which was characteristic of Ruth. She circled things before she landed on them, not out of timidity, but out of the particular carefulness of someone who had learned that the wrong words at the wrong moment could close a door that the right words would have opened. They were at the work table, mid-morning, with Clara and Gertrude on the other side of the room doing their own work in the understanding way of people who know that a private conversation is happening and are choosing to be somewhere else without making a thing of it. Ruth straightened a seam she didn't need to straighten, then looked up. "My cousin Margaret," she said. "She's in the county east of here. Her husband farms there, or tries to. The soil is the same problem yours was." Abigail looked at her, waiting. "She asked me about your field amendment method, what you're doing with the rabbit manure, the layering, the timing of it. I described it as best I could, but I don't have your notes." Ruth paused. "There are 4 other farmers on her road with the same soil problem. They've been losing yields for 6 years. Abigail set down what she was working on. "I didn't promise her anything," Ruth said quickly. I told her I'd ask you, but if you were willing to write down the method, properly, the way you explained it to Warren Hess with the quantities and the timing, she could share it with those families. Another pause. They'd want to know whether they needed to acquire rabbits themselves or whether there were other ways to get the materials. The method works best with a continuous supply, Abigail said, which means animals. But rabbit acquisition doesn't have to look like what I did. They don't need 64 to start. They could start with 10 or 12 and scale. Ruth looked at her. Would you be willing to sell breeding stock? Some of the Flemish giants, maybe? They're the highest producers. Abigail had not thought about this specific angle yet, and she sat with it for a moment, turning it over. Breeding stock sales. Teaching the method. Potentially, over time, a network of farms using the same approach, which meant a network of farms producing fiber. Not Angora necessarily, not all of them, but material that she could potentially source and process and bring into the production side of her operation without being solely dependent on her own animals. She could see it. She could see exactly how it could work, the same way she'd seen the field amendment potential in 64 rabbits on a trader's wagon. Tell your cousin to write to me, she said. I'll put the method in writing and send it back. And yes, I can sell breeding pairs. Not until the spring, when I've got the numbers where I need them here. But by May, I could let a few Flemish pairs go without compromising my own production. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was relief and something else, something more personal. She's had a hard few years, Ruth said. Her husband tries, but the land, you can't farm land that won't produce. It takes something out of people. I know, Abigail said. You fixed yours, Ruth said simply, and went back to her seam. March came in with the particular quality of a season that had not quite decided to be itself yet. Cold mornings, afternoons that suggested warmth was theoretically possible, mud that appeared as the snow receded and revealed what winter had done and not done to the fields. Abigail walked the east field on the first day the ground was soft enough to push a boot into it without resistance, and she crouched down and picked up a handful of soil and felt it and looked at it and smelled it, which was something she'd learned from a pamphlet and then refined through months of actual attention. It was different, meaningfully different, not perfect. Soil recovery didn't work on a dramatic timeline, and she was realistic about what one season of amendment could achieve. But she could feel the difference in the way it held together in her hand, the way it had color and moisture and the faint biological quality that depleted soil lacked. She thought about what it would look like in 5 years, if she kept doing what she was doing. She thought about what it had looked like in September, when she had stood in it in the early dark and understood the problem without yet understanding the solution. She put the soil back and stood up and looked at the field. She planted the east field in the 3rd week of March, which was earlier than most people in Clearwater County planted and later than she would have preferred, a compromise between the soil temperature and the pressure of having waited long enough. She planted root vegetables and leafy crops in the sections closest to the barn, things that would come up reliably and quickly and that she could eat or sell through the summer without depending on a single large harvest, and left the south section for the grain planting she was planning for April when the temperature would be reliably above freezing at night. Eli helped with the planting. He came on the planting days without being asked, which she had stopped being surprised by. He showed up when things needed doing, which was a quality that some people had and some people didn't, and that couldn't really be taught, only cultivated in someone who already had the underlying inclination. They worked side by side, pushing seeds into earth that was cold and damp and smelled like the beginning of things. And Eli said, in the middle of a long stretch of quiet, I want to learn the full operation. Abigail pushed another seed into the row she was working. You've been learning it for 6 months. I mean properly. All of it. The fiber processing, the field management, the breeding records, the business side. He was looking at the ground as he worked, which was how he said things he'd been thinking about for a while and wasn't sure how they'd land. When I'm old enough to have my own place, I want to know how to do this. She didn't say anything immediately. She thought about it. You're already doing most of it, she said. What you're asking for is the documentation, the records, and the reasoning behind the decisions. Yes. Then start keeping your own records, parallel to mine. Write down what you observe and what you think it means, and then we'll compare. She moved to the next section. That's how you actually learn something, not from being told, but from having to see it yourself and write down what you saw. Eli was quiet for a moment. My father did that with weather, kept a weather journal for 15 years. Does it help him? He says he can read a storm 3 days out now that he couldn't see at all when he was young. That's what I mean, she said. He started keeping the records the following week. She would look at them sometimes when he left them on the barn wall. His handwriting was small and precise, the observations careful in the way of someone who had been told that seeing clearly was a skill that required practice and had taken that seriously. He was not always right in his interpretations, but he was always looking, which was the foundational thing. The first letter from Ruth's cousin arrived in April. Her name was Frances Okafor, and she wrote clearly and without preamble, which Abigail appreciated, a list of specific questions about the amendment method, the rabbit varieties, the hutch system dimensions, the fiber processing setup. Practical questions from a practical woman who had read what Abigail had sent and wanted to understand it fully before she implemented anything. Abigail wrote back the same day. She answered every question and added 3 things Frances hadn't asked, but would need to know based on mistakes Abigail had made in the first month that Frances could avoid if she had the information ahead of time. She wrote the kind of letter she would have wanted to receive in October, which was the only useful standard for instruction she knew. Frances wrote back within the week, and then again 2 weeks after that. By May, they had established a correspondence that was part practical exchange and part something that didn't have a name yet. 2 women on different pieces of frontier land, solving related problems, comparing notes on what worked and what didn't and why, neither of them performing certainty they didn't have. In May's letter, Frances mentioned that her neighbor had acquired 12 rabbits and was beginning the field amendment process. In June's letter, she said that 2 more families on the road had started asking questions. She said the soil on their farm was responding. She said her husband had started believing in it in the specific way that skeptical men started believing in things. Not loudly, not with acknowledgement that he'd been skeptical before, but visibly, in the way he talked about the South Field and the way he stopped changing the subject when she brought up the spring yields. Abigail read these letters at the kitchen table in the evenings, after the work was done, and she felt something she'd been too busy to feel for most of the previous 8 months. The specific satisfaction of something spreading outward beyond what you could see from where you were standing. The market at Clearwater Junction ran on the first Saturday of every month from May through October, and Abigail had a table at it for the first time in May, with Clara beside her, and a display of finished goods that represented 6 months of production refinement. The mittens were better than the first ones she'd made. The construction was cleaner, the sizing more consistent, the pelt preparation more thorough. The Angora blend yarn was available in small skeins, priced at the rate she'd calculated for the Cincinnati market, and found that people here would pay once they understood what they were holding. Harriet's 6 kits were 5 months old, and their fiber was extraordinary. The first harvest from 4 of them had yielded material finer than anything she'd gotten from Harriet herself, which suggested that whatever the buck had contributed to the genetics had not worked against the Angora quality and might have improved it. She had 1 small skein of the kit fiber on the table, not for sale, as a demonstration piece. People picked it up. They held it the way people held things that surprised them, carefully, with a slight change in their facial expression that preceded the words they were going to say. Margaret Hollis was there in the morning. She came to the table with the particular directness of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it before they can talk themselves out of it. She looked at the display, and she looked at Abigail, and she said, "I owe you an apology." Abigail looked at her. "I should not have dismissed you the way I did in November," Margaret said. "I was wrong about the product, and I was wrong about you, and I knew I was wrong before winter was over, but I didn't say it." Her chin was up in the way of someone delivering something uncomfortable and determined to deliver it cleanly. "I'm saying it now." Abigail had thought, over the winter, about what she would feel if Margaret Hollis ever said this. She had expected to feel some version of vindication, the specific satisfaction of being acknowledged right by someone who had called you wrong. What she actually felt was something simpler and less interesting than that, just the mild relief of a thing being said that needed to be said, the way you felt when a seam that had been puckering was finally pulled smooth. "Thank you," she said. Margaret looked at the demonstration skein. "Can I feel it?" "Go ahead." She picked it up and held it in both hands, and her expression did the same thing everyone's expression did. Then she set it down carefully and looked at Abigail. "How many are on the waiting list for yarn?" 14 people as of this morning. I'll have enough to fill the list and still have inventory by August." "I'd like to put the store in for a standing order," Margaret said, "if you're willing." Abigail kept her face even. Come by Monday, and we'll work out the terms. Margaret nodded and moved away, and Clara, who had been managing the other end of the table with the professional discretion of someone who had heard the whole exchange and was choosing not to react to it, waited exactly 5 seconds and then said, in a very quiet voice, Don't, Abigail said. I didn't say a thing, Clara said, and rearranged a display piece she didn't need to rearrange. By August, the East Field had produced beyond Abigail's first-year projections, which she was honest enough to admit she had written conservatively because she hadn't wanted to commit herself to numbers she wasn't sure she could meet. The root vegetables had come in well, not spectacularly, not without the usual losses to weather and pest pressure and the 100 small failures that farming always involved, but well enough that she had both food for herself and surplus to sell, which was the threshold she'd defined as the minimum and had reached and exceeded. The grain section was the real revelation. She had planted a modest amount, more experiment than commitment, wanting to see what the amended soil would do before she bet more acreage on it. What it did was produce at a rate that made Thomas Dawson, who came to look at it in July, when the crop was clearly going to be what it was going to be, stand at the field fence for a long time without saying anything. The South Quarter, he said finally. Are you amending it this season? Second season of amendment, full planting next year. He looked at the East Field. She knew what he was thinking because she had been thinking it herself for weeks. That what the East Field was doing was not exceptional by the standards of well-managed frontier farmland, but was exceptional by the standards of what this specific soil had been capable of producing a year ago. What does it take, he said, to get a field to this point? What's the actual minimum? She told him. Number of animals, amendment cycle, timing, labor involved. She told him straight, without making it more complicated than it was or simpler than it was, which was the only way she knew how to tell people things. He listened the way he always listened. Would you write it down for me? I'll write it up properly, she said. Same version I sent Francis Okafor. Who? Ruth's cousin. She's been running the method on a farm east of here since April. She has 4 neighbors who've started it. She paused. 2 of them got rabbits from me. Thomas looked at her. Something in his expression was doing more than he usually let it do. You've been spreading the method. Francis asked. I answered. Abigail. It's just information, she said. It's not just information, he said, and looked back at the field, and she let it sit there because she didn't have a better answer, and he wasn't wrong. Well, Gertrude had a proposal in September, which she delivered with the same flat certainty she brought to all her opinions, with the difference that this one had clearly been thought through carefully in advance. She sat across from Abigail at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her that she had written on and crossed out and rewritten, which was visible from the state of the paper, and she pushed it across the table. I want to come in formally, she said, as a partner, not as a worker for wages. Abigail looked at the paper. It was a rough outline of terms, Gertrude's contribution in labor and the pelt processing expertise she'd brought to the operation, offset against a percentage of the operation's revenue going forward. The numbers were not unreasonable. They were, in fact, thoughtfully structured. Where did you learn to write a business outline? Abigail asked. My father was a merchant, Gertrude said. I grew up watching him negotiate. A pause. I've been watching you do it for 9 months. You're better at it than he was. Abigail looked at this paper for a long moment. She had not expected this, which was strange because she should have seen it coming. Gertrude had invested herself in the operation in a way that went well beyond the wages she was paid, had brought improvements and innovations, and her 15 years of hard work expertise to every production problem without once suggesting that her contribution was anything other than what she was paid for. She had been treated like a worker because Abigail had not been paying attention in the right direction. She recognized that now, looking at the paper, with the particular discomfort of realizing that she had done to Gertrude, in a smaller way, what others had done to her. Seen a surface roll and not looked at the person underneath it carefully enough. This percentage, she said, pointing to a line on the paper. Is this what you think your contribution is worth, or what you think I'll agree to? Gertrude looked at her steadily. What I think my contribution is worth. I think it might be higher than this, Abigail said. Gertrude's expression did something small and controlled. Then I'm open to revision. They renegotiated. It took 2 hours, and they each gave ground on different points, which was how it was supposed to work. When they were done, Abigail made a copy of the revised terms in her own hand, and they both signed both copies, and Gertrude put her copy in her coat pocket and sat back and looked at Abigail with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be recognized, and has finally had it recognized and is not going to make a scene about it. "Thank you," Gertrude said. "Thank you," Abigail said back, and meant it differently than Gertrude had meant it, and they both knew that. The first payment under the restructured loan terms came due in October, and Abigail made it 10 days early. She had Aldous Fike take it to the bank in person because she wanted it delivered in person, not mailed, and she wanted a receipt dated in October and not the 1st of November. Aldous came back with the receipt and set it on her table without comment, and she thanked him and filed it in the tin box where she kept the important documents, next to the original loan papers and Granger's restructuring letter, and the field amendment records, and the correspondence with Francis Okafor, that had grown into a stack of 15 letters over 7 months. She stood at the table after Aldous left and looked at the tin box for a moment. In the tin box there was the whole arc of it, not the whole story, because the story had happened in the barn and the field and the kitchen and on the road in a blizzard and at a work table in winter and in a banker's office on a cold January afternoon. But the documentary evidence of a thing that had been tried and had failed to fail, which was a different kind of success than people usually meant when they used the word. She put the lid on the box. In November, on the 1-year anniversary of the day, she had walked into Clearwater Junction and handed $3 to a trader named Dolph Marsh. Eli came to the homestead for what had become his regular Saturday, and he brought his record book with him the way he always did now, and they sat at the kitchen table and went through the year's data together the way they had started doing at the beginning of fall. The barn held 83 rabbits. Harriet's 6 kits were thriving, their fiber better than expected. 2 more breeding cycles had run successfully, managed by Abigail and Gertrude together, with the careful records that were now thorough enough to project yield 3 harvests out. The East Field had produced. The South Quarter was into its 2nd season of amendment. The order ledger for the fiber operation had a waiting list that extended into the following spring. Francis Okafor's farm was producing its first properly amended crop, and she had written in October's letter that her husband had told her, without quite admitting he was saying it, that he thought they were going to be all right. Eli went through the numbers with the focused attention he'd developed over a year of keeping his own parallel records. He asked questions, made observations, pushed back once on a yield projection she had written that he thought was conservative in a way that would lead her to underplan the spring planting. He was right. She revised it. "You've been right more than you've been wrong this year," she told him. She said it plainly, as a fact, because it was one. He looked up from his record book. He was 15 now, had grown a couple of inches since September, in the way teenage boys grew, a little faster than seemed strictly necessary. He had the serious face she'd first seen in the barn doorway with a biscuit tin, a year older and carrying more behind the eyes than it had then. "You have too," he said. "I've been wrong about a few things." "Name one." She thought about it. "I should have approached Thomas Dawson first, not Margaret Hollis. I knew his situation was the right entry point for this product, and I went to the easier target first because I was nervous." She looked at the record book between them on the table. "Nervousness dressed up as practicality. I've done that more than once." Eli considered this. "That's a real answer. I try to give those." He closed the record book. He looked around the kitchen, at the production table, the spinning wheel with the finally repaired drive wheel that no longer wobbled, the work surfaces that 4 people used regularly and that bore the evidence of that use in ways that a room used by one person alone never did. Then he looked back at her. "What was the hardest part?" he asked. "Of the whole year?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the specific question, not the version of it she might have expected to be asked. Not the hardest moment or the hardest decision, but the hardest part. The quality of it, the sustained thing. "Being seen as a story before I was seen as a person," she said. "People decided what I was, what I meant, what I was going to do, how it was going to end, before they had information. And then the story they decided traveled faster than anything I could do to correct it." She looked at the window, at the yard she could see through it, at the barn beyond. "I couldn't argue with the story. I could only make something real enough that the story eventually ran out of room." Eli was quiet. He thought about things before he said them, which had been true at 14 and was more true at 15. "Clara told my mother that you changed how she thought about things," he said. "Not farming things, just things. How you approach things you don't know yet. Abigail looked at him. Ruth said the same, basically, different words. He picked up the record book and turned it over in his hands. I think what they mean is that you don't pretend you know things you don't, and you don't stop doing things because you don't know them yet. Those two things together are unusual. She did not know what to do with that exactly, so she let it sit. My father, Eli said, and stopped. What about your father? He said. Eli looked at the table. He said, you're the reason he's going to try the amendment method on the North pasture next spring. He's been farming that pasture for 12 years and it's been declining for 4, and he kept trying the same things harder instead of trying something different. He paused. He said watching someone else not be afraid of something different was useful. Abigail thought about Thomas Dawson, who was not a man who said things for effect, who had counted out money on a workbench for a pair of mittens because they were worth what she was asking, who had stood at the field fence in July and looked at what patience and a different approach had done to soil that everyone had written off. Tell him I'll lend him the field records, she said. He can run the numbers himself before he commits. He'd like that, Eli said. What? On the last Saturday in November, Abigail walked the east field in the early morning before anyone else arrived, the way she sometimes walked it alone when she needed to think in the specific way that movement helped her think. The ground was frozen again. The first real freeze of the coming winter, the first day it had held all the way through noon, and her breath came out in white clouds in the still cold air, and her boots made a particular sound on the frozen ground that was different from any other season's sound. She walked the full perimeter, stood in the middle. The field was empty now, the last of the fall crop harvested, the ground turned and covered, waiting for spring. There was nothing to see in it that you could point to and say, there, that is the thing that changed. The change was in the soil, invisible below the frost. The change was in the structure of the ground and the biology of it, in what would happen in April when the temperature came up and the seeds went in and the earth did what properly managed earth did. She thought about a year ago. She stood in the same field and let herself actually think about it. Not the version of it she had reduced to lessons or patterns or useful observations, but the actual experience of it. The wagon ride with Chester Briggs and his steady, unkind inventory of everything wrong with the place she was heading. The first evening in the field, knowing it was depleted, not knowing yet exactly how she would fix it. The rabbits on Dolph Marsh's wagon, 64 animals in wooden crates with no good future ahead of them. She thought about being cold and eating carefully through November. She thought about Granger's preliminary notice arriving in the mail and the specific weight of it. She thought about the storm and the Vetter children and Pearl Vetter's serious face as she delivered an envelope her sick father had funded by selling a saw. She thought about sitting on a porch step in February cold reading a letter from a banker who had changed his mind and written it down. None of it had been clean. None of it had unfolded the way plans unfolded in the telling of them afterward. She had made mistakes and misjudgments and had been scared in the practical way, and had eaten less than she should have, and had been dismissed in ways that cost her more than she'd let show, and had gotten things wrong and corrected them and gotten other things wrong. She had not arrived at this field as a changed person. She was the same person she had been in September, a year ago, just in possession of more information and surrounded by more people than she'd been surrounded by then. That was what actually happened when things went well. Not transformation, just accumulation of knowledge, of trust, of the kind of small reciprocal connections that built over time into something that held when the worst weather came. She turned and walked back toward the barn, where she could hear Harriet beginning her morning editorial about the feeding schedule, and where in an hour Eli would arrive with his record book, and Gertrude would come through the side door with her sewing kit, and Clara would make too much coffee, and Ruth's youngest might fall asleep in the corner again. She thought about Francis Okafor's letters, stacked in the tin box. She thought about the families on the road east of here who were amending their soil right now, through the winter, getting ready for a spring planting that was going to be different from the ones before it. She thought about Thomas Dawson's North pasture and what it would look like in 3 years if he did what she thought he was going to do. She had not set out to change anything beyond her own small piece of frontier land. She had set out to survive, to build something that worked, to prove to herself that what she could see was real. The rest of it, the spreading of it, the way it had moved outward through Ruth and Francis and Thomas, and the letters and the orders and the conversations she hadn't even been present for, that had not been the plan. It had been the consequence. She was not sure, even now, whether she deserved credit for the consequence. She had done the thing in front of her. Other people had carried it forward because they decided it was worth carrying. That was not her achievement, that was theirs. What she thought she had done. The thing she could actually claim, if she was being honest with herself in the cold of a November morning, with her breath coming out in clouds and the frozen field behind her, was stay. She had stayed when the weight of the doubt was considerable, and the alternative of leaving was always available, and nobody would have blamed her if she'd taken it. She had stayed and done the work, and not required anyone else to believe in it before she did. That was smaller than the stories people told about things like this. It was also harder, she thought, than the stories made it sound. She pushed open the barn door. The warmth of 83 animals, and the smell of hay, and the particular familiar sound of this place that was hers wrapped around her, and Harriet looked up from her hutch with the expression of a creature who has been waiting an unreasonable amount of time for her breakfast, and intends this to be known. "I know," Abigail said. "I'm here." She picked up the feed scoop and got to work.